On a gray January morning in 1963, a British intelligence officer named Nicholas Elliott sat alone in a safe house in Beirut, Lebanon, and listened to his oldest friend in the world confess to 3 decades of treason. The confession was measured, almost clinical, delivered by a man with impeccable manners and a slight stammer that had always made him seem more trustworthy than the people around him, not less. The officer across the table had known this man since before the war. He had defended him in front of committees. He had staked his own reputation on his friend's innocence. And now, in a rented apartment in a city that smelled of diesel and jasmine, he was hearing the truth for the first time, and the truth was worse than anything he had imagined. The man sitting opposite Nicholas Elliott was Harold Adrian Russell Philby, known to everyone who mattered as Kim, senior officer of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service, decorated servant of the Crown, and for 30 years, a devoted and deliberate agent of Soviet intelligence. A spy so deeply embedded in the institutions of British power that the damage he caused would take decades to even begin to calculate. This is the story of how that happened. How a boy from the fading edge of the British Empire became the most damaging penetration agent in the history of Western intelligence. How he smiled and stammered and drank his way through the most sensitive corridors of power in London and Washington, passing secrets to Moscow the entire time. How he survived suspicion, investigation, and the defection of his closest associates, not through luck alone, but through a combination of class, charm, and the institutional blind spots of the very world he had sworn to protect. A British intelligence officer sitting across from his oldest friend. A man he had defended in front of committees, staked his reputation on, trusted completely, and listening to him confess to 30 years of treason. Kim Philby did not just spy for the Soviets. He ran the British operation designed to catch Soviet spies, all while feeding Moscow everything it needed to destroy it. If you have ever wondered how the most catastrophic intelligence betrayal in Western history was possible, subscribe to the channel right now and stay with this story. What he did and how long he got away with it will genuinely disturb you. But to understand Kim Philby, you have to understand where he came from. And that means understanding his father. Harold Adrian Russell Philby was born on January 1, 1912, in Ambala, in the Punjab region of British India. The name Harold was his given name, but no one would use it for long. His father, St. John Philby, was a complex and domineering figure, an officer in the Indian civil service who would eventually become one of the most celebrated Arabists of his generation, a close advisor to Ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia, and a man who converted to Islam and spent years living in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula under the name Abdullah. St. John Philby was brilliant, restless, iconoclastic, and constitutionally incapable of fitting into the establishment that had educated him. He admired the Arab world and held the British Foreign Office in contempt. He cultivated outsider status as a point of pride while simultaneously craving the respect of those he affected to disdain. The nickname Kim came from Kipling, from the young spy boy in Rudyard Kipling's novel, the orphan son of an Irish soldier who learns to move between worlds, to wear different identities with equal ease, to pass invisibly through landscapes of colonial power. St. John Philby gave his son that nickname with an affection that was also, in some ways, a projection of his own ambitions. He wanted his boy to be fluid, capable, at home in multiple worlds simultaneously. He got what he asked for, though not in the way he intended. The family returned to England when Kim was still a young child, and St. John's absences from domestic life became longer and more frequent as his career in Arabia deepened. Kim's mother, Dora Johnston Philby, was left largely alone to raise her son in the comfortable but not lavish circumstances typical of the imperial professional class. She was a quiet woman, devoted to her children, who had made the practical calculations required of a wife married to an extraordinary, self-absorbed man. Kim adored her in a way that he never quite recaptured with anyone else. The stability she provided stood in sharp contrast to the unpredictable energy of his father, who would return from months in the desert full of stories and opinions and radical ideas, then disappear again. Kim was sent to Westminster School in London, one of England's most prestigious secondary schools, where the sons of diplomats and civil servants and academics learned the particular combination of intellectual confidence and social fluency that was expected of them. He was a good student, attentive, widely read, quietly competitive. He did not excel through flashiness but through absorption, through a habit of listening more than he spoke, noticing more than he revealed. Teachers remembered him as bright, composed, and likable. Classmates recalled his stammer, which could be severe under pressure, stuttering consonants piling up behind his lips while he waited for the sentence to release itself. He had learned to use the hesitation as a tool rather than a liability. The slight pause before the words arrived made listeners lean in, created an impression of thoughtfulness rather than impediment. In 1929, Kim Philby won a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge. He arrived in October of that year, 17 years old, carrying his father's intellectual ambition and his mother's careful self-possession, entering one of the most consequential institutions in the history of British public life at one of the most consequential moments in the history of the modern world. Cambridge in 1929 was not the placid seat of tradition it sometimes appeared from the outside. Beneath the Victorian stone and the punting and the formal halls ran currents of intense political argument. The aftermath of the First World War had shattered the confidence of an entire generation in the capacity of liberal capitalism to maintain order or deliver justice. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had offered an alternative vision. Flawed, violent, contested, but undeniably alive. And then, in October of that same year that Philby arrived at Cambridge, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The great crash of 1929 sent shock waves through the global economy that were still reverberating 4 years later when Philby graduated. Unemployment shredded the working-class communities of Britain. The hunger marches of 1932 and 1933 brought tens of thousands of desperate men through the streets of English cities. Fascism was accelerating across Europe. Mussolini had been in power in Italy since 1922, and in Germany, a political movement of extraordinary viciousness was gathering momentum toward the catastrophe that would define the coming decade. For a generation of Cambridge undergraduates who had grown up reading the promises of liberal civilization and were now watching those promises dissolve into breadlines and rising thuggery, the appeal of an organized, systematic alternative was not irrational. It felt, to many of them, like the only honest response to what they were seeing. Marxism offered a coherent diagnosis of what had gone wrong with capitalist society and a theory of how it might be transcended. The Soviet Union, for all the information that was beginning to filter out about its internal brutalities, still represented to many young Western idealists the only power in the world actively committed to resisting fascism. These were not stupid people. They were people reading the evidence available to them and drawing conclusions that seemed, in the early 1930s, to have a logic to them, even if that logic would later curdle into something far darker than any of them had imagined. Kim Philby's political journey at Cambridge was gradual but directional. He began his studies in economics, attending lectures by the economist Maurice Dobb, who was openly Marxist and regarded by many students as one of the most intellectually serious teachers at the university. He read widely Marx and Engels, but also the contemporary debates about socialist planning and the critique of imperialism. He joined the Cambridge University Socialist Society in the early 1930s, not as a radical but as a thoughtful participant in the conversations that consumed the most serious minds of his generation. His father's example was somewhere in all of this, operating as a kind of submerged template. St. John Philby had chosen to place his loyalty to an idea, his understanding of Arabia, his vision of an independent non-colonial world, above his loyalty to the institutions that had trained and employed him. He had broken with the establishment when the establishment conflicted with what he believed to be right. His son was making a similar calculation, though the ideology and the methods would be very different. Where the father had been a public rebel, loudly and unmistakably his own man, the son would become something far more dangerous, a hidden one. The precise moment of Kim Philby's ideological commitment is difficult to pin down with certainty. It happened gradually, through conversations and reading and the accumulated weight of what he was observing in the world. By the time he graduated in June 1933, taking his degree in economics, a respectable second-class honors, the foundations of what would become a lifelong commitment were already in place. The question was no longer whether he believed in communism. The question was whether he was willing to act on that belief in a way that would define the rest of his life. The answer would come within months. The person who would help him arrive at it was a Hungarian communist refugee named Edith Tudorhart, a photographer living in London who moved in radical circles and who had excellent contacts with the Soviet intelligence apparatus then operating in Western Europe. Through her, Philby would be introduced to a man named Arnold Deutsch, a Vienna-based Soviet intelligence officer working under the cover name Otto, who had been sent to Britain specifically to identify and cultivate exactly the sort of well-placed idealist that Cambridge had been producing at an accelerating rate. Deutsch was sophisticated, patient, and psychologically perceptive. He understood that the most valuable agents were not those who could be coerced or paid, but those who could be genuinely convinced, who had burning in them a faith that made them willing to do almost anything in service of the cause. He met Kim Philby in the summer of 1934. He found in him something remarkable, a young man with first-class connections, superb emotional control, a gift for social performance, and a genuine ideological commitment that ran all the way to the bone. Deutsch reported back to Moscow that Philby had exceptional potential. He was, in Deutsch's assessment, a man who could go very far indeed inside the British establishment, was already being directed toward exactly the sort of career that would make him uniquely valuable. The recruitment was handled with care. Philby was not asked to make a dramatic declaration of loyalty. He was asked to keep his political views private, to gradually distance himself publicly from the left, and to begin building the kind of bourgeois conservative reputation that would open doors in official Britain. He was asked, in other words, to become someone else, to wear a mask so consistently and convincingly that it would eventually become indistinguishable from a face. Philby accepted. He would later describe this decision in his memoir with characteristic cool, as a straightforward act of political commitment, a logical extension of his convictions, a reasoned choice made by a man who had examined the options available to him and selected the one that seemed most likely to contribute to the world he wanted to help build. What he did not say, and what the decades that followed would slowly make plain, was the cost of that choice, the corrosion that comes from sustained deception, the slow hollowing out of a self maintained too long in hiding. He left Cambridge in the summer of 1933 as Harold Adrian Russell Philby, scholarship boy, economist, product of Westminster and Trinity. He would move through the next 30 years as something else entirely. A ghost fluent in the language of trust, a servant of two masters who never forgot which one he truly served. The city of Vienna in the winter of 1933 was a city in the process of tearing itself apart. The Austrian Republic, born out of the rubble of the Habsburg Empire after the First World War, had never been entirely stable. Three competing political forces had been maneuvering against each other since the Revolution of 1918, and by the time Kim Philby arrived in the city in the autumn of that year, the tensions between them had reached a pitch that made ordinary daily life feel like the waiting period before something catastrophic. Philby had come to Vienna on what was, on the surface, a straightforward postgraduate endeavor. He had been given enough money by his mother to live for a year in Europe, to learn German, to broaden himself in the continental manner that was expected of serious young Cambridge men. The official purpose was education, self-improvement, the gathering of the kind of wide experience that would prepare him for whatever career followed. The unofficial purpose, which only he and his Soviet handler Arnold Deutsch knew, was the beginning of his operational life as a Soviet intelligence agent. Specifically, his first assignment, which was to make contact with the underground communist network operating in Vienna and render whatever assistance he could. Vienna's political geography in 1933 was layered and combustible. The conservative Christian Social Party controlled the federal government under Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, a tiny man of rigid authoritarian conviction who had suspended parliament in March of that year and was moving steadily toward one-party rule. On his right flank, the Austrian Nazi movement was growing rapidly, funded and inspired by Hitler's Germany, which had achieved power in January and was already remaking the German state with a speed and thoroughness that alarmed everyone paying attention. On the left stood the Social Democrats, who controlled Vienna's city government and had built in the Austrian capital one of the most ambitious experiments in workers' welfare in the world. The vast housing blocks, the health clinics, the libraries and cultural centers that had given Red Vienna its international reputation. The communist underground in which Philby would briefly move was separate from and often in tension with the Social Democrats, regarding them as insufficiently revolutionary, as compromisers who had chosen the ballot box over the barricades. But both were targets of Dollfuß's consolidating government, and both knew that time was running out. The question was not whether the regime would move against them, but when and how severely. It was in this charged and dangerous atmosphere that Philby made the acquaintance, and then something much more than the acquaintance, of Alice Frieda Coleman, known to everyone as Litzy. She was 24 years old, sharp-featured, with dark eyes and the kind of unstoppable energy that made every room she entered feel smaller. She had been born into a middle-class Jewish family in Vienna, had become politically active at university, and by the time she met Philby she was deeply embedded in the underground communist network, carrying messages, hiding people who needed to disappear, doing the operational work that kept clandestine organizations alive. They met through a mutual contact in the network, almost certainly arranged or facilitated by Deutsches Handler apparatus, though the exact circumstances are not clear from the available records. What is clear is that the attraction between them was immediate and mutual. Litzy was everything that the well-bred English girls of Philby's acquaintance were not: politically committed, intellectually combative, physically bold, and unconcerned with the social proprieties that governed romantic behavior in his native milieu. For a young man who had just made the most significant ideological commitment of his life, she was also a living embodiment of what that commitment meant. Someone who was putting herself at genuine risk for the cause, not simply arguing about it over port in a Cambridge common room. They became lovers within weeks. By the end of 1933 they were inseparable, Philby moving through the Viennese underground alongside her, learning the rhythms of clandestine work, the careful routes through the city, the coded conversations, the protocol of trust that governed who was told what and when. He was new to all of it, still developing the iron emotional discipline that would later become his defining characteristic, but he learned quickly. He had, it turned out, a natural aptitude for this kind of life, for maintaining one face while serving another purpose, for carrying information that could not be written down, for performing ordinary social behavior while carrying inside him the knowledge of things that had to remain hidden. The crisis came on February 12, 1934. Dollfuß had been waiting for a pretext to move against the Social Democrats, and when paramilitary forces loyal to the government searched the Social Democratic Party offices in Linz, the workers' militia, the Schutzbund, resisted. The resistance spread quickly to Vienna, where the great housing blocks of Red Vienna became fortresses from which armed workers attempted to hold off the government forces. The Austrian Civil War, as the four-day battle came to be known, was brutally unequal. The government had artillery, the workers had rifles and the conviction that history was on their side. Neither was sufficient. Philby was in the city during all 4 days of the fighting. He drove an ambulance or helped to coordinate one. The accounts vary slightly. Under the aegis of relief organizations, moving through streets where the sound of shellfire had replaced the sound of trams and morning traffic. He witnessed the shelling of the Karl-Marx-Hof, the great socialist housing complex on the Heiligenstadter Strasse, which had become a symbol of everything that Red Vienna had been trying to build. The building was not destroyed, but the idea it represented was. By February 15th, the Social Democrats were broken, their leaders either arrested, fled, or dead. The Austrian Republic's last meaningful democratic institution had been eliminated. In the aftermath of the fighting, Litzy was in danger. As a known member of the underground communist network in a city where the government was now conducting systematic arrests, she faced the real possibility of imprisonment. And given the network's knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations in Austria, the risks were more serious than a simple arrest on political grounds. Philby made the decision to marry her. By doing so, he could provide her with a British passport, which would allow her to leave Austria and reach safety in England. They were married in February 1934, weeks after the fighting ended, in a ceremony that was purely practical in its immediate motivation, though not, apparently, entirely devoid of genuine feeling. Philby would describe Litzy in later years with a warmth that was evident even through the careful prose of his memoir. They left Vienna together in the spring of 1934, arriving in England with the marriage certificate and the lessons of the Austrian underground, and with Philby's Soviet handler already thinking carefully about what his new agent's next move should be. The mission from here on would require patience. It would require the construction of a new public identity, or rather, the careful dismantling of the old one and the building, in its place, of something entirely different. Arnold Deutsch understood this clearly. The Cambridge network he was assembling. Philby was already one of several recruits, though none of them knew about the others by deliberate design, was conceived as a long-term investment. These were not agents who would be asked to steal a document from a filing cabinet or take a photograph through a window. They were being positioned, over years and possibly decades, to rise to positions of genuine authority inside the British state. Positions from which the intelligence they could provide would be not just tactical but strategic, not just useful but transformative. For that to work, each of them had to become, to all outward appearances, precisely the kind of establishment figure they had privately repudiated. For Philby, this meant a deliberate and sustained journey to the right. It was not enough to simply stop attending socialist society meetings or to stop being seen in left-wing company, though he did those things. He needed to actively construct a new political identity, to become, in the eyes of the people who mattered, someone whose loyalty to the established order was unquestionable. He needed references. He needed a reputation. He needed history, the kind that could be checked and verified by suspicious minds. And because the 1930s were a decade in which the most dramatic political question in the world was the battle between communism and fascism, the most effective place to establish right-wing credentials was not at home in England, but in the heart of the conflict in Spain. Before Spain, though, there was the work of remaking himself in London. Philby returned to England in the spring of 1934 and set about cultivating the social world that his Cambridge connections naturally opened to him. He joined the Anglo-German Fellowship, a pro-German friendship society that drew together British aristocrats, businessmen, and establishment figures who admired Hitler's Germany and believed that the two northern European powers should find common ground rather than head toward another ruinous war. The fellowship was, by the mid-1930s, attracting exactly the kind of people who moved in the highest circles of British political and social life. Membership was, in effect, a gesture of right-wing solidarity, a visible signal of the political direction its members had chosen. For Philby, joining was a calculated maneuver, a piece of the cover story he was building, a way of planting his flag on the opposite side of the political battlefield from the one on which he had spent his Cambridge years. He was careful, methodical, and utterly convincing. People who met him during this period came away with an impression of a cultivated, intelligent young man of firmly conservative views, mildly eccentric in the way that the sons of remarkable fathers often are, with a slight stammer that somehow made him seem more earnest, more trustworthy than the fluent people around him. They had no reason to look beneath the surface. The surface was exactly what they expected to find. His Soviet controller, by this point operating through a London-based handler, as Deutsch had moved on to other assignments, was in regular contact, receiving reports and directing the longer-term strategy. The instructions were consistent. Be patient, build the reputation, get into journalism, aim for the institutions that handled foreign affairs and intelligence. The pace was deliberately slow. There was no urgency on Moscow's part, because the value of what they were building only increased the more thoroughly it was constructed. Throughout this period, Philby maintained the marriage with Litzy, though it had quickly become more of a practical arrangement than a romantic one. She remained politically active in London's émigré left-wing circles, a world that Philby was now visibly removing himself from. The contrast was inconvenient. A man ostentatiously cultivating pro-German, right-wing credentials while his wife attended Communist Party meetings was a story that could unravel things before they had properly begun. But Litzy was discreet when she needed to be, and the social worlds of 1930s London were sufficiently compartmentalized that the contradiction was manageable, at least for now. What was happening beneath the surface of these careful maneuvers was something the people around Philby had no instrument for detecting. He was not performing his right-wing opinions while privately nursing communist ones. He had gone further than that. He had so completely organized his inner life around the requirements of his double existence that the boundary between the performance and the performer had begun to blur in ways that were useful operationally and deeply complicated personally. The man who attended Anglo-German fellowship dinners and made the appropriate conversation about the threat of Bolshevism was not lying in a way that caused him visible discomfort. He had absorbed the discipline of the work into the structure of his personality, made it part of how he moved through the world. That was what made him dangerous. Not the mask alone. Many people wear masks, but the extraordinary completeness with which he had fused the mask to the face. In July of 1936, the Spanish Republic ceased to be a stable political entity and became instead a battlefield. General Francisco Franco led a military uprising against the elected government in Madrid, and within weeks Spain had cracked open into one of the most brutal and ideologically charged conflicts of the 20th century. For the governments of Europe, it was a proxy arena. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supplied Franco's nationalist forces with weapons, aircraft, and troops, while the Soviet Union provided material support to the Republic, and tens of thousands of young men from across the democratic world poured into Spain as volunteers to fight for a cause that many of them believed to be civilization's last line against fascism. For Kim Philby, it was something else, an operational opportunity of the first order. His Soviet handlers recognized it immediately. Spain in 1936 offered Philby the chance to do two things simultaneously: to build an impressive journalistic career that would establish him in the most serious company of international correspondence, and to complete the ideological reinvention he had been pursuing since his return from Vienna. A journalist covering the nationalist side, Franco's side, would by definition have right-wing credentials that no one could convincingly manufacture from a London drawing room. The work would be real. The datelines would be real. The articles would be read by editors and intelligence officers who spent their days looking for patterns of deception, and they would find nothing because there was nothing to find on the surface. The surface was genuine. Philby secured a letter of introduction to the nationalist forces through the Anglo-German Fellowship, which was exactly what it was designed for, and arrived in Spain in February 1937. He was accredited as a freelance correspondent, selling his dispatches to a number of publications before landing an arrangement with the Times of London, the paper that was still regarded, with some justification, as the nearest thing to an official voice of the British establishment. Being a Times correspondent in nationalist Spain was not simply a career achievement. It was an entrance pass into the uppermost corridors of a campaign that was being actively supported by the fascist powers that were reshaping European politics. The work itself was genuinely dangerous. Philby moved with nationalist units through the Spanish interior, covering battles and military operations, eating and drinking with officers and foreign correspondents, and the international observers that Franco's headquarters attracted. He developed the practiced ease of a man who has been under pressure and emerged from it unchanged, the quality of steadiness and good humor that combat journalists develop as a kind of professional armor. He was brave. The accounts of his behavior in Spain from colleagues and military officers alike emphasized this. In February 1937, he was in a car that was struck by Soviet-supplied artillery fire that killed 3 other journalists. Philby survived, apparently entirely by chance, with light injuries. Franco awarded him the Red Cross of Military Merit in 1938. A decoration that would later prove useful in shutting down any questions about his political sympathies during his wartime career. What no one around him in Spain knew was that the dispatches Philby was sending to the Times had a shadow version, reports to Moscow that contained everything his journalistic access had uncovered, but organized and interpreted along lines that served Soviet intelligence rather than Fleet Street. The Spanish Civil War was a place where Soviet intelligence was operating intensively, running networks inside the Republican government, attempting to monitor and manage the various factions of the left, and keeping track of the foreign intelligence services that were operating alongside the nationalist forces. Philby's position gave him access to information about British and German intelligence activities in Spain, the kind of material that Moscow Center valued enormously. He was also given, at some point during his time in Spain, a task of a different and darker character. The NKVD, Soviet State Security, the predecessor organization of what would eventually become the KGB, was engaged during this period in the systematic elimination of perceived enemies, a campaign that extended far beyond Soviet borders. Leon Trotsky, Stalin's exiled rival, was the most famous target, and his eventual murder in Mexico in 1940 was the culmination of years of effort. But Trotsky was not the only target, and Spain in the 1930s was full of people that the NKVD regarded as problems to be solved. Several Soviet intelligence documents released after the Cold War suggest that Philby was at various points asked to provide information that would assist in identifying and locating specific individuals, information that could have contributed to their arrest or worse. Philby himself never addressed this aspect of his work in Spain in any great detail, and the full picture remains a matter of historical dispute. What is not disputed is that he was, by the latter part of his time in Spain, a fully operational Soviet agent, not merely a passive provider of information. He returned to England in 1939 as the Spanish Civil War ended with Franco's victory, carrying a reputation that was, from the perspective of the British establishment, essentially perfect. He had worked for the Times. He had covered the nationalist side sympathetically. He had a Franco decoration to show for his trouble. He had been through genuine danger and emerged from it with his composure intact. The people who would soon be running Britain's wartime intelligence agencies looked at Kim Philby and saw exactly what they needed: a tested, well-connected young man with first-class journalistic instincts and the kind of cool under fire that the work ahead would demand. They saw none of what was actually there. The Soviet agent who had spent 3 years in Spain accumulating exactly this reputation for exactly this purpose, building a credential that would function like a key to the doors that mattered most. The road to those doors ran through Section D. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the machinery of British intelligence began a rapid and somewhat chaotic expansion. The Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, was already a relatively old institution, though its wartime incarnation would look very different from its peacetime origins. One of its early wartime components was Section D, which had been established in 1938 to work on what were delicately called irregular operations, sabotage, subversion, and the disruption of enemy infrastructure. Section D was staffed partly by career intelligence officers and partly by outsiders brought in for their specific skills or knowledge, and it was looking, in the autumn of 1939, for people who could contribute to the effort. A former Times foreign editor named Ralph Deakin, who had known Philby's work from Spain, provided an introduction. It was supplemented by other recommendations from people in the journalistic and social circles Philby had been cultivating since his return from Vienna. People who could speak to his character, his discretion, his willingness to do difficult work without complaining. The introduction was made. An interview was conducted. And in the summer of 1940, Kim Philby was taken on by Section D. He was not yet inside MI6 proper. Section D was shortly afterwards folded into the newly created Special Operations Executive, and Philby found himself for a brief period in a bureaucratic limbo as the institutional landscape of British wartime intelligence reorganized itself around him. But the important thing was that he now had a foot in the door. He had clearances. He had access to conversations and documents that civilian journalists never approached. And he had, through his time in Section D, made the acquaintance of a sufficient number of senior figures in the actual intelligence service that when the opportunity arose to move from the Special Operations Executive into MI6 itself, the path was already partially cleared. The move into MI6 happened in 1940. Philby was taken on as an officer of the Secret Intelligence Service, initially in a training capacity. He was involved in running courses for new agents and officers, which gave him both a detailed knowledge of MI6 operational methods and the chance to assess and get to know a wider range of personnel within the service. From there, he moved steadily upward through the organizational structure, each promotion opening larger compartments of intelligence, wider networks of information, deeper access to the operational planning that represented the real prize. Moscow Center was patient. The instructions remained consistent. Work hard, be reliable, be liked, advance. Do not request access to material, Let the access come naturally through promotion and reputation. Do not take unusual risks. The value of the asset was in the long term, not in the spectacular short-term haul. What Moscow was receiving from Philby in these early years was not yet the crown jewel material that would come later. But it was already valuable. The structure of MI6, the identities of officers and their areas of responsibility, the methods used to run agents and process intelligence, the relationships between MI6 and its partner services in the Allied countries. This was the kind of foundational intelligence that allowed Soviet intelligence to build an understanding of the British system that would serve them for decades, an understanding of how it worked, where its weak points were, and how to exploit them. In his personal life, Philby's marriage to Litzy had effectively ended, though the legal dissolution took some years. He had become involved with Aileen Furse, a woman he had met through social connections in London, and who would eventually become his second wife. Aileen was not a communist. She was not involved in intelligence in any way. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her, a warm and somewhat fragile woman who had fallen genuinely in love with Kim Philby and had no idea that the man she was building a life with was simultaneously living a completely separate existence that he never discussed, never revealed, and never felt conflicted enough about to abandon. The compartmentalization that Philby had been practicing since his Soviet recruitment in 1934 had by now become so thoroughly integrated into his personality that he carried it without visible strain. He was a devoted father in the moments he was present. He was a reliable colleague, always available to help, easy to work with, never difficult over credit or territory. He was a good drinker, able to consume remarkable quantities of alcohol at the social events that were the natural ecosystem of the British intelligence world, without ever losing the precision of his judgment or the discretion that the work required. The stammer was still there, still operating its odd social magic, making people feel that the slight hesitation before each sentence was the mark of a man who thought carefully before speaking, which he did. He just thought about more things simultaneously than the people listening ever suspected. By 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union and transformed the political alignments of the war overnight, Philby was already well established inside MI6. The German invasion put Britain and the Soviet Union on the same side, at least formally, for the duration of the conflict, which meant that the material Philby was passing to Moscow was simultaneously helping the intelligence service of an ally. This created a kind of surface-level justification that some of the Cambridge network found psychologically useful. The lie was a little more comfortable when it could be dressed in the clothes of Allied solidarity. Philby was too cold-eyed for that kind of self-deception, but he was aware of how the strategic situation had changed the optics of what he was doing. He used the warmth of the Anglo-Soviet alliance to his advantage wherever he could, positioning himself as someone enthusiastic about cooperation and intelligence sharing with the Soviets, an enthusiasm that his superiors took as political maturity and professional flexibility. It was, of course, something else entirely. To understand the full dimensions of what Kim Philby was able to do inside MI6, it helps to understand the culture into which he had inserted himself. The secret intelligence service of the Second World War era was not primarily a bureaucratic institution in the manner of a government department. It was something older and stranger, a world organized around personal networks, social connections, and the particular form of trust that British upper-class men extended instinctively to other people who had come through the same schools, the same colleges, the same clubs. The old boy network, in other words, that dense web of shared background and mutual obligation that had been the operating system of the British establishment since the Victorian age. This culture was Philby's natural environment, not because he wholeheartedly subscribed to its values, but because he had been born into it and educated within it, and he understood its language perfectly. He knew which stories to tell, which names to drop, which attitudes to project, and which silences were preferable to the wrong words. He knew the difference between the kind of reserve that suggested discretion and the kind that suggested coldness, and he pitched his behavior to suggest the former. He was, to the people who worked alongside him, simply one of them, a bright, reliable, sociable colleague who happened also to be very good at the work. The work, during the middle years of the war, involved him increasingly in the operational and analytical side of MI6 activities. He was assigned to the Iberian subsection, appropriate given his Spanish background, and then to work connected with North Africa during the campaigns there. In each role, he established the pattern that would carry him through his entire intelligence career: thorough preparation, calm judgment, a capacity for sustained work without visible strain, and an availability to help colleagues that made him both popular and well-informed. People came to Philby with problems because Philby was reliably helpful. And every problem that came to him, every confidence extended, every file shared in the spirit of collegial cooperation, was ultimately intelligence flowing in Moscow's direction. The tradecraft of his communications with Soviet intelligence during the wartime years was, necessarily, adapted to the circumstances. The London-based Soviet intelligence apparatus had to be cautious about direct contact with a source as sensitive as Philby. Any surveillance of the Soviet embassy or its associated personnel could, if it caught Philby in proximity, destroy the entire operation before it had reached its peak value. The method used was a series of intermediaries, people who could meet Philby in the kind of social settings, dinner parties, pubs, weekend gatherings in the country, that were entirely unremarkable for a man of his position. The tradecraft was good. Moscow Center ran their British networks with meticulous care, understanding that the investment they were protecting was of a type that might not come again in a generation. One of the key figures in this system was Anthony Blunt. If Philby was the most operationally skilled of the Cambridge Five, Blunt was perhaps the most socially elevated, an art historian of genuine distinction who would go on to become the surveyor of the King's pictures, responsible for maintaining the royal collection. Blunt had been recruited in the early 1930s around the same time as Philby by the same network through the same Cambridge channels. He was working during the war in MI5, the domestic counterintelligence service that operated separately from MI6, which gave him access to a different but equally valuable stream of information. The existence of a simultaneous penetration of both MI5 and MI6 by the same Soviet network was one of the most catastrophic security breaches in British intelligence history, and it continued undetected throughout the entire duration of the conflict. The others in the network that Soviet intelligence called the Magnificent Five, though the British press would later call them the Cambridge Five, included Donald Maclean, a brilliant diplomat who was working in the Foreign Office and eventually in the British Embassy in Washington, where his access to Anglo-American communications and planning material was of extraordinary value. There was Guy Burgess, the most extravagantly self-destructive of the group, a flamboyant, promiscuous, chronically drunk BBC broadcaster and Foreign Office official whose behavior was so frequently outrageous that it paradoxically served as a kind of cover. People who knew Burgess assumed his various indiscretions were purely personal rather than operational. And there was John Cairncross, who worked for a period at Bletchley Park, the top-secret establishment where Britain's codebreakers were deciphering German and other enemy communications, a position that gave him access to some of the most sensitive intelligence produced anywhere in the Allied world during the entire war. Each of them operated independently, without direct knowledge of the other's identities as Soviet agents. This compartmentalization was a fundamental principle of professional intelligence tradecraft, and the NKVD had applied it with discipline. If any one of them was caught and interrogated, they could only confirm their own guilt. They could not lead investigators to the others because they genuinely did not know who the others were. The only person who was aware of all of them, or nearly all of them, was Philby, by virtue of his unique position within British intelligence, which gave him visibility across a wider range of personnel and operations than any of the others possessed. The wartime intelligence passed through this network to Moscow was staggering in its scope and sensitivity. Maclean provided Anglo-American communications that illuminated the political relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill in real time, giving Stalin information about Western intentions and decision-making that he could use in his own negotiations with his allies. Cairncross's material from Bletchley Park included decrypted German military communications, the product of Ultra, Britain's most closely guarded secret, which Soviet military planners used to their advantage during the critical battles on the Eastern Front, though exactly how much the Soviets benefited from this material and how much they already knew through other channels remains a matter of historical discussion. Blunt provided material on MI5's operations, its methods, and its personnel. Burgess contributed what he could from the Foreign Office. And Philby provided the comprehensive institutional picture: the MI6 order of battle, the identities of officers, the methods and communication systems, the planning of operations, and, increasingly, the intelligence derived from Ultra and from other highly classified sources that flowed through MI6 management structure. His position gave him not just individual pieces of information but the ability to contextualize and synthesize them, to provide Moscow with an understanding of how British intelligence worked from the inside, which was worth more than any individual document. The material on Ultra was among the most sensitive of all. Ultra was the product of the operation at Bletchley Park that had broken the German Enigma cipher, a cryptographic achievement of extraordinary difficulty and consequence that had given the British, and eventually the Americans, the ability to read large portions of German military, naval, and diplomatic communications. The existence of this capability was one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the entire war. The British went to enormous lengths to prevent the Germans from suspecting that their codes had been broken, including, on several documented occasions, allowing military operations that might have been disrupted to proceed, rather than take actions that might alert the Germans to the compromise. The entire architecture of Western wartime strategy was built around protecting this secret. Philby's access to intelligence derived from Ultra extended into his work, and what he passed to Moscow in this area gave the Soviets information whose provenance could not be revealed without revealing Ultra itself. Exactly what Stalin's government did with this material, whether, for example, they were able to confirm the existence of the Bletchley operation, and if so, whether they protected that intelligence in their own handling of the resulting information, is a question that historians have wrestled with for decades. The Soviet archives have not been fully opened, and the picture that can be reconstructed from available sources is necessarily incomplete. What is clear is that Philby knew exactly what he was doing. He was not a man making compromised choices under pressure. He was making fully informed, deliberate ones. He had been doing so since 1934, and the wartime period, far from creating any crisis of conscience, seems to have deepened his commitment. The war against Nazi Germany was the war that his beliefs had always predicted would come, and the Soviet Union was, in his view, the only power that was bearing the full weight of fighting it on land. The Eastern Front consumed German military resources on a scale that dwarfed anything happening in the West, and the human cost to the Soviet Union was catastrophic in a way that impressed itself even on people who had every reason to maintain skepticism about the Soviet system. Philby, who had no such skepticism, found in the wartime alliance a confirmation rather than a complication. He was also, during these years, doing something that was not strictly espionage but was closely related to it. He was managing his own position within MI6 with the skill of a genuine careerist. He was liked by his superiors, assigned to progressively more important work, and seen as someone on an upward trajectory. He cultivated relationships strategically, was genuinely helpful to people who could help him in return, and presented himself consistently as a man committed to the service's mission. A man, in other words, who was building a career on the same foundations of trust and performance that any ambitious MI6 officer might use. By the middle of the war, he was approaching the threshold of something that would represent the ultimate prize in his long project of institutional penetration. A position so central to the most sensitive intelligence operations against the Soviet Union that his value to Moscow would become almost incalculable. The moment that position came within reach, he reached for it. In the autumn of 1944, Kim Philby was appointed head of the newly created Section 9 of the Secret Intelligence Service. Section 9 was MI6 anti-Soviet section, its dedicated unit for intelligence gathering, counterintelligence operations, and agent running directed against the Soviet Union. In a service that occupied itself with the full spectrum of foreign intelligence threats, the anti-Soviet section was arguably the most consequential and politically sensitive responsibility in the entire organization. The Soviet Union was still, in the autumn of 1944, Britain's ally against Germany. The war in Europe would not end until the following May. And yet the British government and its intelligence services already understood clearly enough that the end of the Nazi threat would not resolve the fundamental tension between the Western democracies and the communist state that Stalin was building with a ruthlessness that left no room for illusion. The man who had lobbied for the creation of Section 9 and had helped to define its mandate was a senior MI6 officer named Felix Kaugyl, who had been running counterintelligence work against the Soviets on an ad hoc basis from within the broader service structure. Cowgill wanted the section formalized, resourced properly, and given a clear operational brief. What he did not anticipate was that the officer who would eventually be appointed to run it, in a bureaucratic maneuver that Cowgill himself initially supported, having been successfully manipulated into doing so, would be the Soviet agent who had been working against his service for the past decade. The appointment was Philby's most audacious achievement, and it was not accidental. He had been watching the internal politics of MI6 with the attention of a man who understood exactly what was at stake, and when the opportunity arose to guide the outcome toward the result Moscow needed, he guided it. The mechanism was elegant. Cowgill, for all his intelligence expertise, was not a skilled office politician. He had made enemies, and Philby knew how to work with those enemies, encouraging them in their frustrations while presenting himself as the reasonable alternative. A man who could lead the new section with the efficiency and political skill that Cowgill, whatever his merits, had demonstrated he lacked. The lobbying was invisible because it was conducted socially, through conversation rather than formal advocacy, at the kind of dinners and casual gatherings where the real decisions in institutions like MI6 were made. It worked. Cowgill was eased out. Philby was appointed. And the man in charge of British intelligence operations against the Soviet Union was, at that moment, reporting everything he knew to Soviet intelligence. The sheer scale of the damage that followed from this appointment is difficult to fully comprehend even now, decades later, with the advantage of historical hindsight and the partial release of records from both the British and the Soviet sides. Section IX's operations against Soviet intelligence required, as a baseline, significant knowledge of how Soviet intelligence worked, its organizational structure, its methods, its priorities, the identities of its officers operating in various countries. Philby had access to all of this, and every piece of it flowed back to Moscow. When Section 9 began building files on Soviet intelligence officers who had been identified operating in Western Europe, Moscow knew the files were being built, knew which of their officers had been compromised, and could take measures to protect the most important ones while allowing lesser figures to be sacrificed if necessary to maintain Philby's credibility. When Section 9 began planning counterintelligence operations, surveillance of Soviet personnel, attempts to identify and turn Soviet agents, the construction of counterintelligence cases against suspected Soviet operatives, Moscow knew the plans before they were implemented. This gave Soviet intelligence the ability to insulate its operations from British counterintelligence in a way that would have been impossible without a source inside Section 9. Cases that might have been made against Soviet agents in Britain and Western Europe were quietly made unmakeable, not through dramatic intervention but through the patient adjustment of the conditions that might have led to detection, moving people, adjusting methods, abandoning operations whose cover had been silently compromised. The intelligence services of Britain's allies were also caught in the same exposure. Section 9 liaised with the intelligence and security services of the United States, France, and other Western countries on matters relating to Soviet intelligence. When Philby attended those liaison meetings and participated in those discussions, the contents of the conversations went to Moscow. The American FBI's efforts to identify and counter Soviet espionage networks operating in the United States, networks that remained active throughout and after the war, were hampered in ways that those conducting them could not understand at the time, because the source of their difficulties was sitting at the same table, listening with apparent attentiveness and contributing with apparent helpfulness. There was one operation during this period whose consequences were particularly severe, though it would not become publicly known until years later. In August 1945, a senior NKVD officer named Konstantin Volkov walked into the British consulate in Istanbul and offered to defect. Volkov was the acting head of Soviet intelligence in Turkey, and what he had to offer was extraordinary. He claimed to be able to provide the identities of 3 Soviet agents operating inside the British intelligence services, 2 in the Foreign Office and 1 in a senior post in British counterintelligence. The subject who would most naturally match that third description, a senior counterintelligence officer in the British intelligence services, was Philby himself. Volkov's offer was communicated to London through the standard secure channel. The message landed eventually on Philby's desk. The timing was extremely tight. Volkov had set conditions. He wanted the response within 3 weeks, and he wanted to travel to the west rather than wait for British intelligence to come to him in Istanbul. He was also, apparently, aware of the risk of Soviet intercept, because he had specifically asked that no communications relating to his offer be sent through cipher, fearing, correctly as it turned out, that the Soviets had broken some of the British codes. Philby read the file carefully. He then alerted Moscow. What followed was managed with the cold precision that characterized the NKVD at its most dangerous. Philby volunteered to handle the Volkov case personally, flying to Istanbul as the senior officer responsible for assessing the defector's bona fides and managing his extraction. He traveled. He arrived. He was met with the news that Volkov was no longer available, that he had apparently been identified and removed by Soviet security before the British could reach him. The timing of Volkov's disappearance relative to Philby's journey to Istanbul was later, in retrospect, unmistakable. But in 1945, in the disorganized and overstretched machinery of wartime intelligence wrapping up its operations, the connection was not made. Volkov was flown back to Moscow. What happened to him there is not definitively established in the available records, but the pattern of what the Soviets did with intelligence officers who attempted to defect leaves little room for optimism. He was almost certainly executed. He was certainly silenced. The names he had been prepared to hand over, including Philby's own, were never delivered. Philby returned to London. He filed his report on the Volkov case, which attributed the defector's disappearance to poor operational security on the Istanbul station's part, a finding that was not entirely implausible given the genuine deficiencies in British intelligence procedures in Turkey at the time. The report was accepted. No serious inquiry followed. Section IX's head had managed the case. The case was closed. The episode illustrated what made Philby genuinely unique as a penetration agent, beyond the obvious fact of his access. He was not simply a conduit for information flowing from Britain to Moscow. He was an active intelligence officer working on behalf of Moscow inside the British system, someone who could identify threats to his Soviet operation and take action to neutralize them, while appearing to do the opposite. He was not managing British intelligence operations. He was running a Soviet operation from within British intelligence, using the resources and authority of his official position as instruments in the service of his actual employer. This is a distinction worth dwelling on, because it changes the scale of what he was. Passive agents, people who photograph documents and pass them to a handler, do damage in proportion to the sensitivity of the documents they access. Active agents, people with the authority and judgment to shape operations, to direct inquiries, to make decisions about what gets pursued and what gets dropped, they do damage in proportion to the decisions they make. Philby was the second kind. After the war ended, the strategic importance of the work changed but did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. The wartime alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union evaporated with a speed that surprised even those who had expected it, replaced within 2 years by the confrontational posture that would define the Cold War for the next 4 decades. The intelligence requirements on both sides expanded enormously, and Philby, as head of Section 9, was at the center of the British effort to understand and counter Soviet capabilities at precisely the moment when that effort was being rebuilt from scratch for a post-war world. The material he was passing to Moscow now was not wartime operational intelligence. It was the architectural intelligence of the Cold War itself. The plans, the methods, the personnel, the capabilities, and the intentions of the most important Western intelligence service in the new confrontation. Moscow was being given the blueprint. The house they were trying to break into was being walked through by the man who had been hired to guard it. The city of Washington in the autumn of 1949 was a city caught in the grip of a particular kind of anxiety, the background hum of a society that had won its war and organized its peace and was now discovering, with repeated jolts of alarm, that the peace was considerably less secure than it had initially appeared. The Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear device in August of that year, for years earlier than most Western estimates had predicted, and the shock of that news was still reverberating through the government buildings and committee rooms and private clubs of the capital. The Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong had driven the nationalist government from the mainland in October, completing the most consequential single shift of allegiance in the Cold War's brief but turbulent history. And somewhere inside the American government, as the FBI and the Army Security Agency were beginning to suspect with increasing confidence, there were people who had been helping these things happen. Into this fraught atmosphere, in the autumn of 1949, came Kim Philby, arriving as MI6 Chief Liaison Officer to the newly created Central Intelligence Agency and to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was 47 years old, broad-shouldered, drinking heavily but carrying it well, with the manner of a senior professional who had seen more than most of the people he was meeting and had the measured confidence to show for it. He moved into a house in Washington with his second wife Aileen and their children, established himself in the social world of the capital's intelligence and diplomatic community, and began the work of building the most important intelligence relationship in the Western world, while simultaneously delivering its most sensitive contents to Moscow. The Washington posting represented the apex of his career as a Soviet agent, not because his subsequent operations lacked importance, but because the access he now had combined unique strategic sensitivity with the remarkable circumstance that no one in Washington seriously suspected him. He was not untrusted. He was, in the estimate of the people around him, one of the most trusted individuals in the entire Anglo-American intelligence relationship. The CIA had been formally created in 1947 out of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, and it was still in the process of building its institutional identity, its capabilities, and its internal culture when Philby arrived. The director at the time was Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillen-Coetter, though the figure who would have the greatest personal significance for Philby was James Jesus Angleton, the head of the CIA's counterintelligence staff. Angleton was a man of extraordinary intellectual intensity, a Yale-educated poet and aesthete who had been converted during his wartime service in London to an almost mystical belief in the importance of counterintelligence and the analysis of deception. He had studied under a British officer named Kim Philby, who had served as his primary intelligence tutor during the war years, and the relationship between them had developed into something that looked very much like friendship, the kind of bond that forms between two people who share an unusual intensity of mind and a similar appetite for the hidden architecture beneath the surfaces of events. Angleton trusted Philby completely. He had known him for years, had learned his craft partly from him, and had no basis, no concrete evidence, no behavioral anomaly, no data point that would survive analysis, on which to build any alternative assessment. The trust was real on Angleton's side, not performed or feigned. And Philby, for his part, genuinely liked Angleton in the way that charming, intelligent, duplicitous people sometimes genuinely like the people they are most thoroughly deceiving. The relationship gave Philby access to the innermost thinking of the CIA's counterintelligence operation, the cases being built, the defectors being assessed, the vulnerabilities being investigated, the operations being planned against Soviet intelligence. The FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was a different matter. Hoover's feelings about Philby, and about the British intelligence connection generally, were cooler and more suspicious than Angleton's. Hoover was a career domestic intelligence bureaucrat who had spent decades building the FBI's authority against institutional rivals, and he had a constitutional wariness of foreign liaison that made him less immediately accessible than the CIA. But even Hoover's establishment was sharing information with Philby that had no business going anywhere near a Soviet intelligence asset. The coordination between British and American intelligence services on matters related to Soviet penetration of Western governments, the very question that would eventually unravel the Cambridge network, ran directly through Philby's office. The operation that would come to cast the darkest shadow over his Washington tenure was one that had been conceived and was being planned from almost the moment he arrived. The joint Anglo-American effort to insert guerrilla fighters into Albania for the purpose of destabilizing or ultimately overthrowing the communist government of Enver Hoxha. The Albanian operation, sometimes referred to in its broader context as Operation Valuable on the British side and Operation Fiend on the American, was part of a wider strategy known as rollback, the idea that rather than simply containing Soviet power within the lines established by 1945, the West should take active measures to undermine and reverse communist rule in the satellite states of Eastern Europe. Albania was chosen because it was geographically isolated. It shared no border with the Soviet Union itself, had strained relations with Yugoslavia following Tito's break with Stalin in 1948, and had a significant émigré community in Italy and Greece that included men willing to return to their homeland covertly and work against the Hodja regime from within. The plan was to insert groups of trained agents across the borders by boat and by parachute, connect them with resistance networks, gather intelligence, and eventually build a paramilitary capability that could challenge the communist government directly. The planning was done in London and Washington. The recruits were trained in Malta and Cyprus. The communications architecture was built. The insertion schedules were drawn up. And at every stage of the planning, Philby had access to the operational details, the landing zones, the timing, the communication frequencies, the cover identities, the contact protocols. Every item of that planning went to Moscow. The first groups went in during 1950. They were met on arrival. The Albanian Security Service, advised and reinforced by Soviet intelligence, was waiting for them at the insertion points. Most were captured immediately. Some were killed. A few managed to evade capture for brief periods before being tracked down. The operation continued for 2 years, sending group after group into a country whose defensive apparatus had been systematically warned about each incoming wave in advance. The men who went in were, in effect, being sent to their deaths by the intelligence system that was supposed to be protecting them, betrayed before they ever set foot on Albanian soil. The human cost was severe. Estimates of the total number of men captured, killed, or executed in the Albanian operation vary, but the overall toll was devastating for the émigré networks involved and for the individuals who had been persuaded that the Western powers had the capability and the commitment to support them effectively. Their failure discredited the concept of active rollback, not because the concept was necessarily wrong, but because it had been made impossible by the presence of a Soviet agent at the center of the planning apparatus. The lesson that Western intelligence drew from Albania, that rollback operations were inherently too costly and too easily compromised, was itself partly a product of the sabotage rather than a genuine assessment of the strategy's viability. Philby watched all of this from his Washington office with the steady composure that was his most remarkable professional attribute. He filed his reports, attended his meetings, hosted his dinner parties, maintained his friendship with Angleton, and drank enough whiskey at the Georgetown social gatherings that were the living room of Washington intelligence culture to seem entirely normal. The drinking was genuinely heavy by this point. It had been accumulating for years, a habit that his colleagues interpreted as the social lubricant of a gregarious British intelligence officer rather than any indication of interior strain. There was, in Philby's management of alcohol, something that resembled his management of everything else. A controlled excess, a performance of ease that contained within it a studied deployment of tolerance. His personal life during these Washington years was becoming more complicated. Aileen had developed serious psychological problems, periods of apparent self-harm, episodes of emotional instability that required medical attention, a general deterioration that the pressures of being Kim Philby's wife were not helping. She had 4 children with him, would eventually have 5, and was managing a household, social calendar, and domestic existence that depended entirely on a man who was only partially present even when he was physically in the room. The consequences for her were severe, though her husband's emotional unavailability, so thorough, so systematic, so complete, was not something she could have articulated in terms of tradecraft and covert operation. She simply experienced its effects. Guy Burgess arrived in Washington in the summer of 1950, assigned to the British Embassy as a second secretary. The assignment was not Philby's doing and was not welcome. Burgess was brilliant, politically acute, and personally catastrophic. A man who had been drinking and creating scenes and making enemies since his undergraduate days, whose unconcealed homosexuality in an era when it was both criminalized and career-ending was only one of many habits he deployed with an aggressive disregard for consequences. His arrival in Washington immediately complicated Philby's carefully maintained social position. Burgess moved into Philby's house, which was a practical necessity from Burgess's perspective and a significant liability from Philby's. The two men were publicly associated in a way that could become dangerous if Burgess's behavior attracted the wrong kind of attention. The attention was coming. And what was about to bring it was not Burgess's drunken dinner party performances or his aggressive political arguments. It was something far more precise, running in parallel through the machinery of American signals intelligence, encrypted in 5-digit code groups on old teletype intercepts from 1944 and 1945. A thread that had been patiently unraveling for years and was almost ready to break. The thread that would eventually unravel the Cambridge network had its origins not in a spy's careless mistake or an informant's tip, but in a technical operation of extraordinary ambition, one of the most significant signals intelligence programs ever attempted, whose very existence remained classified for decades after the events it helped to precipitate. In 1943 and 1944, a small and highly secretive unit within the United States Army Signal Security Agency had begun an effort to decode encrypted Soviet diplomatic communications that had been intercepted since the early 1940s. The Soviets used what was theoretically an unbreakable cipher system, the one-time pad, in which each message is encrypted using a genuinely random key that is used only once and then discarded. If the system is implemented correctly and the keys are never reused, one-time pad encryption is mathematically secure against any code-breaking effort regardless of the computational power applied. The theory was sound. The implementation was not. Under the extreme pressure of wartime, the Soviet cipher clerks in Moscow had made a critical error. They had produced and distributed duplicate copies of some of the one-time pad key sheets, meaning that the same key material had been used to encrypt multiple messages. For a trained codebreaker, a reused one-time pad is not unbreakable, it is an opening. The mathematical relationship between messages encrypted with the same key can be exploited to begin reconstructing the underlying plaintext. The work is enormously labor-intensive, requiring the manipulation of thousands of intercepted messages and the patient application of linguistic and mathematical analysis, but it is possible. The operation to exploit this vulnerability was given the cover name Venona, a word chosen for its blandness, its absence of any meaning that might suggest the program's purpose to anyone who encountered the name. Work on the intercepts proceeded slowly through the latter part of the war and into the post-war years, occasionally producing fragments of deciphered text that were assembled into partial messages, then partial conversation threads, then slowly emerging patterns of communication. By the late 1940s, the Venona analysts had recovered enough to begin identifying some of the individuals referred to in the Soviet communications, including agents operating inside the United States government and its wartime partner institutions. The key breakthrough for the Cambridge network came through the analysis of messages that revealed the existence of a Soviet source with access to the British mission at Washington, a source referred to in the decrypted communications by a cover name. The communications indicated that this source had been providing highly sensitive information about Anglo-American nuclear and diplomatic planning. The description, combined with what was known about who had access to the relevant intelligence at the relevant time, pointed toward Donald Maclean. Maclean had served in the British Embassy in Washington from 1944 to 1948, where he had been head of Chancery, a senior diplomatic position that gave him extraordinary access to Anglo-American communications, including material connected to the atomic energy program. He had returned to London in 1948, and by 1950 was head of the American Department of the Foreign Office. The investigations were cautious, slow, and complicated by the need to protect the Venona program from exposure, because revealing how the identification had been made would alert the Soviets to the fact that their supposedly unbreakable communication system had been partially cracked. In Washington, Philby was receiving regular, detailed briefings on the progress of the Venona investigation. He was, after all, the MI6 liaison officer, keeping him informed of developments in the investigation of a British diplomat suspected of Soviet espionage was exactly what the liaison relationship was designed for. Every meeting in which the Americans shared their analysis with him became a transmission to Moscow. Every piece of identifying information, every parameter of the investigation, every indication of how close the investigators were to making a definitive identification was passed through Philby's regular communications with his Soviet handlers. Moscow knew the investigation was closing in on Maclean. The question was how to extract him, and who else needed to move at the same time. Guy Burgess, who had been spectacularly misbehaving in Washington through the autumn and winter of 1950 and into 1951 in ways that had finally exhausted the patience of the Foreign Office, was recalled to London in May 1951. His assignment in Washington had effectively ended, and he was facing serious disciplinary proceedings. He was also, from Moscow's perspective, a potential liability, not because the Venona investigation had reached him, it had not, but because his association with Philby meant that any serious investigation of Burgess might circle back in directions that were dangerous. The initial plan, as Philby communicated it to Burgess before his recall, was for Burgess to travel to London and alert McLean through the existing network communications, giving McLean the signal to prepare to leave. The instruction was that Burgess himself would not defect. His departure from Britain would be too visible, too rapid, too suggestive, and his continued presence in London, however turbulent, provided a degree of cover for the operation of alerting McLean. Burgess agreed. And then, in one of the episodes that most clearly demonstrated his fundamental unsuitability for the kind of disciplined clandestine work the situation required, he changed his mind. On the evening of May 25, 1951, Donald McLean and Guy Burgess boarded a cross-channel ferry at Southampton. They told the friends and colleagues aware of their evening plans that they were taking a brief holiday trip to France. They did not return. By the time their absence was noted, they were beyond reach, moving through a Soviet extraction route toward the Iron Curtain. They arrived eventually in Moscow, where they would spend the rest of their lives, emerging occasionally to give carefully managed press conferences or write letters home, as useful to Soviet propaganda as they had been to Soviet intelligence. The effect on Philby was immediate and devastating, professionally speaking. He had known the plan. He had participated in coordinating it. And now the man who had been living in his house, who was publicly his close friend, who had been at his kitchen table and at his dinner parties for months, that man was in Moscow. The investigation that followed would be unable to avoid his name. Within days of the Burgess-McLean defection becoming known, the questions began. Philby was summoned back to London. The process was initially handled with the careful indirection characteristic of institutions that are more comfortable with ambiguity than with direct accusation, particularly when the accusation concerns one of their own senior officers. He was asked to account for his association with Burgess. He was asked about his knowledge of Burgess's political views. He was asked about any advanced knowledge he might have had of Burgess's intentions. He answered all of these questions with the steady composure that had served him for 17 years, acknowledging the friendship, expressing appropriate surprise and dismay at the defection, carefully constructing a narrative in which he was a colleague caught off guard by a colleague's shocking action. But while the interviews and the informal conversations proceeded in London, the broader picture was shifting in ways that the individual interviews could not fully contain. The Americans were furious. The Burgess-McLean defection had been preceded by weeks of intelligence sharing between the British and American services about the Venona investigation, intelligence sharing that had gone through Philby's office. The conclusion in certain quarters of American intelligence, particularly at the FBI, was inescapable. The British had a third Soviet agent, someone who had known about the investigation and had warned Burgess and McLean in time for them to escape. And the most obvious candidate for that third agent was the man who had sat at the center of the intelligence exchange, Philby himself. The CIA was more ambivalent. Angleton in particular found the case against his old friend and mentor almost impossible to accept as definitive on the available evidence. He was not blind to the logical force of the circumstantial picture, but he held out for the possibility of alternative explanations with a tenacity that reflected his genuine emotional investment in the outcome. His hesitation was both understandable and consequential. It meant that the American pressure on Britain to move decisively against Philby was not as unified or as overwhelming as it might otherwise have been. Hoover had no such hesitation. The FBI's position was clear. Philby should be declared persona non grata, removed from any position with access to Anglo-American intelligence, and ideally prosecuted. The diplomatic language used in communicating this view to the British was carefully chosen, but the substance was unambiguous. The special relationship in intelligence terms could not continue if Philby remained in place. He was asked to resign from MI6. He did so in July 1951. The formal grounds were the association with Burgess. He was not charged. He was not prosecuted. He was simply quietly eased out, given a modest severance payment and left to find his way in civilian life, carrying the cloud of suspicion without the clarity of a verdict. The investigation had identified him as a suspect. The evidence was strong, but it was not conclusive, and in the British legal and institutional culture of 1951, something stronger than strong circumstantial evidence was required before a former senior officer of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service could be publicly accused of treason. The threshold was deliberately high, and Philby, who understood exactly where that threshold was and how far the available evidence fell short of it, had calibrated his position precisely to remain on the survivable side of it. He was, for the moment, a man under suspicion but not under arrest. A man out of work but not in prison. A man whose friends were mostly lost to him. Burgess and McLean in Moscow, Aileen deteriorating at home, his career in ruins, but who was still breathing free air in London, still capable of making his next move. The question was whether there was a next move available, and whether the people who suspected him could find the evidence to close the distance between suspicion and certainty before he was able to make it. The interrogation of Kim Philby that followed his removal from MI6 was a remarkable exercise in institutional caution, or, depending on your perspective, institutional failure. MI5, the domestic security service that was responsible for counterintelligence within Britain, conducted the inquiry, and the officers assigned to it faced a challenge that was simultaneously technical and psychological. On the technical side, the evidence available to them was largely circumstantial. The Venona material was still classified to a degree that limited its direct use in interrogation. Material from the program could not simply be laid in front of a suspect and treated as definitive proof without risking the exposure of the program itself. On the psychological side, they were interviewing not a frightened junior clerk caught with a camera over a filing cabinet, but a trained, highly experienced senior intelligence officer who had been managing exactly this kind of situation: the management of risk, the maintenance of cover under pressure, the strategic deployment of partial truth for 17 years. The man who conducted the primary interrogations was an MI5 officer named William Scarden, whose reputation had been made partly by his role in the case of Klaus Fuchs, the German-born British nuclear physicist who had been identified through Venona as a Soviet source inside the Manhattan Project and who had confessed to Scarden in January 1950 in circumstances that demonstrated Scarden's considerable skill as a patient, methodical interviewer. Scarden did not bully. He did not threaten. He built a slow, carefully constructed picture of the case, presenting it piece by piece, watching for the moments where a careful denial might reveal more than silence would have, looking for the places where the story's internal architecture might display a stress fracture under pressure. He found an extremely good opponent. Philby sat through the interrogation sessions in the summer and autumn of 1951 with the composure of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades preparing for exactly this. He acknowledged the friendship with Burgess. He denied knowing about Burgess's Soviet connections. He expressed what the accounts describe as convincing bewilderment at the defection, the bewilderment of a friend deceived rather than a co-conspirator warned. He handled the questions about his Vienna period, about Litzy, about the brief left-wing associations of his Cambridge years, with the practiced equanimity of a man who had long since constructed a serviceable narrative about the idealism of youth, acknowledged and grown beyond. He did not deny everything. That would have been too clean, too perfect, suspicious in its own way. He conceded what was concedable, framed it appropriately, and denied what mattered most. Scarden could make no headway, not because Philby was simply lying in a way that was detectable and improvable, but because the version of events Philby was offering was internally consistent, emotionally credible, and not definitively contradicted by any evidence Scarden could place before him. The Venona material was suggestive but not legally actionable. The circumstantial logic was powerful but not conclusive. The MI5 investigation produced suspicion hardened to near certainty in the minds of many of those most closely involved, but it did not produce, and could not produce, the evidence required to charge and prosecute a British subject with treason. Philby was left in legal limbo. He had lost his career, his income, and the social standing that had been built around his position. His clearances were revoked. His access to official life was gone. He was living in his mother's flat, separated from Aileen, and privately communicating with his Soviet handlers through a contact system that continued to function despite his reduced circumstances. Moscow had not abandoned him. They understood what his position was, a burned asset in the formal intelligence sense, but still a man with knowledge, connections, and the capacity to be rehabilitated if the British investigation ran into the wall it had apparently been pushing against. The political confirmation of that wall's solidity came in November 1955. By that point, a Labour Member of Parliament named Marcus Lipton had raised the question directly in the House of Commons, publicly naming Philby and asking whether he was the third man in the Burgess-McLean affair. The government was forced to respond. The Foreign Secretary at the time was Harold Macmillan, a man of considerable political calculation and personal polish, who stood up in the Commons and effectively cleared Philby of the accusation, stating that there was no evidence that Philby had betrayed the interests of his country. The statement was not an enthusiastic endorsement, but in the peculiar political grammar of parliamentary statements, the absence of confirmation that a man was guilty functioned in the public discourse as something close to exoneration. Philby himself held a press conference at his mother's flat in Drayton Gardens on November 8, 1955, that became one of the most extraordinary public performances in the history of espionage. He was composed, articulate, slightly stammering in the way that audiences found both familiar and somehow reassuring. He denied being a Soviet agent. He denied being the third man. He denied ever having knowingly engaged in any activity contrary to the interests of his country. He fielded questions from a room full of reporters who, by the general rules of such exercises, might have been expected to produce some genuinely probing moment, and he managed each one with the skill of a man who had given more difficult performances in front of audiences far more dangerous than Fleet Street journalists. Only one question came close to piercing the surface. A reporter asked whether Philby had ever been a communist, and Philby said that the last time he had spoken to a communist with knowledge that he was speaking to a communist was in 1934. The answer was technically and narrowly true, calibrated with the precision of a master, and it put the question away. The performance worked. Press opinion in the days that followed was mixed. Some reporters and commentators remained skeptical, but the broader public narrative moved away from Philby is guilty toward Philby has been cleared. The man who had been effectively accused of the most serious possible betrayal of public trust had walked into a room full of journalists and walked out of it with his reputation at least partially restored. The rehabilitation was not immediate or complete. He was still without employment, still without access to official life, still unable to practice the craft he had spent his adult life developing. But the public clearing had changed his status in ways that mattered practically. It made him discussable in circles where he had been toxic, made his name something that could be spoken again in the corridors of the establishment without the automatic assumption of guilt that had attached to it since 1951. The route back to active life came, eventually, through an arrangement that was either an act of extraordinary naivete by MI6 or a calculated gamble with very high stakes, depending on how it is interpreted. In 1956, Philby was approached by MI6 and asked whether he would be willing to work for them again, not in an official capacity, not with reinstatement and clearances, but as an agent in place operating under journalistic cover in Beirut, the Lebanese capital that was rapidly becoming one of the most important intelligence crossroads in the Middle East. He would work as a correspondent for the Observer newspaper and the Economist magazine, covering the Arab world, and he would simultaneously provide information to MI6 on the political and intelligence landscape of the region. There are two ways to read this arrangement. The first is that MI6 genuinely believed Philby was innocent, or that the intelligence value he could provide from Beirut was worth the residual risk. The second is that MI6 wanted him somewhere they could keep him under a degree of surveillance, in a theater distant enough from the most sensitive Anglo-American operations to limit the damage he could do if the worst suspicions about him proved correct. Both explanations have their advocates, and they are not mutually exclusive. Institutional decisions of this kind are rarely made on single, clean lines of logic. What is certain is that Philby accepted, moved to Beirut in 1956, and began operating again. He was by this point a man whose personal life had descended into significant disorder. Aileen had died in December 1957. her health and mental stability having deteriorated for years in ways that combined genuine medical illness with the accumulated effects of her marriage to a man who was, in the deepest possible sense, not present. Their children were provided for, but they were also growing up with the particular confusion of children whose father was someone other people talked about in complicated ways, whose family history was becoming attached to a story that none of them had asked to be part of. Philby threw himself into Beirut with a version of the energy he had always deployed in new postings. Getting to know the city, building contacts, developing the network of social relationships from which journalists and intelligence officers alike extract their understanding of a complex environment. He drank heavily in the bars and restaurants of the Hammer district, cultivated relationships with Arab politicians and Western diplomats, filed his journalistic dispatches with the competence of a man who had never lost the professional baseline he had built in the 1930s and 1940s, and continued his communications with Soviet intelligence throughout. Moscow was receiving from him material on the British and American intelligence presence in the Middle East, on Lebanese political dynamics, on regional operations that passed through the Beirut station. The value was not what it had been in the days of Section 9, when the most sensitive planning documents of the entire Cold War confrontation were flowing through his hands. But it was not trivial, and Moscow continued to maintain the relationship with the patience of an organization that had invested decades in this particular asset and was not prepared to write it off while he remained in the field. In Beirut, he also began a new relationship. Eleanor Brewer was an American woman, married to a New York Times correspondent when Philby met her, who eventually left her husband to be with Philby. Marrying him after Eileen's death was finalized in regard to their separation. Eleanor was intelligent, devoted, and completely unaware of Philby's double life. The third woman to occupy that position, following Litzy and Eileen, each of them in their own way casualties of the sustained deception that was the organizing principle of his existence. The years in Beirut were, viewed from the outside, a settled period. A damaged but functioning man, rebuilding something that resembled a normal life in an exotic posting, writing competent journalism, maintaining his contacts, drinking too much. The cracks that were opening beneath the surface, in Moscow's patience with his reduced operational value, in the continued work of British and American investigators who had never entirely accepted the 1955 exoneration, were not visible from the outside. Not yet. The man who finally brought Kim Philby's double life to its end was, in a profound irony, one of his closest friends. Nicholas Elliott had known Philby since before the war, had risen through MI6 alongside him, had been among the most vocal defenders of his innocence during the investigations of the early 1950s. When the Burgess-McLean affair broke and suspicion first fell heavily on Philby, Elliott had argued for him in internal discussions with a conviction that was entirely sincere. He had staked his professional judgment and his personal reputation on the man's innocence. The thought that he might have been wrong was not simply an intellectual embarrassment. It was a damage to the deepest foundations of how he understood himself and the world he had chosen to inhabit. By the early 1960s, however, the accumulation of evidence had become impossible for even the most sympathetic mind to rationalize away. A Soviet KGB officer named Anatoly Golitsyn had defected to the West in December 1961, bringing with him information about Soviet intelligence networks in Western countries. Golitsyn's material was handled with considerable difficulty. He was a complex source, sometimes accurate and sometimes wildly speculative, and the use he was put to by James Angleton of the CIA, who became intensely attached to Golitsyn's more alarming suggestions about deep Soviet penetration of Western services, would eventually generate one of the most damaging episodes of internal paranoia in CIA history. But amid the noise, some of what Golitsyn provided was solid. And some of it pointed, with increasing specificity, toward a British source of very high seniority, a source whose cover name and described characteristics matched Philby with a precision that made continued ambiguity almost untenable. At the same time, another source was providing information that pointed in the same direction. A senior officer of the KGB's first chief directorate, who was sharing information with British intelligence through a back channel while still in post, provided corroborating detail that tied together Golitsyn's material with the Venona evidence in ways that made the overall picture harder to dismiss. The identification was not a single dramatic revelation but an accumulation, each piece of evidence narrowing the range of reasonable alternative explanations until the remaining alternative was not an alternative at all. MI6 made its decision. Someone would go to Beirut, someone Philby trusted, and confront him, not in the manner of a law enforcement interrogation, not with the objective of obtaining evidence for prosecution, but with the objective of obtaining a confession. A confession would serve several purposes simultaneously. It would confirm what the intelligence assessment had already established. It would potentially produce additional information about the damage done and the people compromised, and it would allow the British government to manage the political consequences in a way that a public arrest and trial would not. The political calculation was cold and clear. A trial would require public disclosure of the Venona program, of the failures of MI6 internal vetting procedures, of the full extent of what a Soviet agent had been able to do inside the most sensitive institutions of British intelligence over 30 years. A quiet resignation, a quiet flight, and a quiet announcement would be permanently less damaging. Nicholas Elliott flew to Beirut in January 1963. He had asked for the assignment, apparently, asked, and been given the task of confronting a man he had defended so fiercely and trusted for so long. The meeting took place in a rented flat, on a date that the available accounts place as January 10th or 11th of 1963. The accounts of what was said come primarily from Elliott's own subsequent recollections, which were given in various forms over the years, and from indications in Soviet intelligence records that have been partially disclosed. Elliott laid out the evidence. He did so directly, personally, without apparent anger. The accounts suggest a tone of controlled sadness rather than accusation, though there was enough of the professional MI6 officer in Elliott's manner to make the coldness of the situation clear. This was not a conversation about feelings. It was an intelligence operation. Philby listened, and then, according to the accounts, he confirmed it. He acknowledged his Soviet recruitment. He acknowledged what he had done. Not in full detail, not in the comprehensive debrief that MI6 would have wanted. He was careful, managing the admission while providing enough to constitute a genuine acknowledgement. But it was enough. The nature of what was agreed in that room is disputed. Elliott's position, as he described it later, was that Philby had been offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for a complete and honest account of his activities. A deal sanctioned at a senior level in the British government. If that offer was made, it was presumably the inducement for the partial confession that followed. Philby may have understood from the conversation that the British were not going to prosecute regardless of whether he confessed, that the reasons they wanted to avoid a trial were strong enough to make prosecution effectively off the table, and that the immunity deal was therefore not a meaningful concession but a face-saving framing for both sides. What is not disputed is what happened next. Elliott left Beirut for other business after the initial meeting, apparently expecting Philby to remain available for a more extended debriefing process. Philby, however, had received the message that the accumulated evidence had delivered, that the British now knew definitively what he was. The choice before him was simple: remain in Beirut and submit to an interrogation process whose outcome, immunity or not, would end his life as a functional human being in the Western world, or go. On the night of January 23, 1963, Kim Philby left his Beirut apartment and did not return. Eleanor, his wife, was not told in advance. She came home to a flat from which her husband had vanished, leaving behind his personal belongings, his books, his clothes, and no explanation. The explanation came eventually, but not in the form she had expected, and not from the direction she had expected it. The mechanism of his extraction from Beirut involved a Soviet freighter. The Dalmatova, a Soviet cargo ship, was in the port of Beirut on that date, and intelligence sources in the decades since have confirmed what was long suspected, that Philby boarded it, was concealed among the cargo, and was transported along a route that took him eventually to the Soviet Union. He arrived in Moscow in late January or early February of 1963, having crossed the final boundary of his life, the one that could never be recrossed. The public announcement was carefully managed on the British side, which was itself an illustration of how thoroughly the political calculation had been made. The disappearance of a man who had already been publicly cleared of Soviet espionage allegations 8 years earlier could not simply be handled as a routine news item. When it became clear that Philby was in Moscow, the BBC received a statement from him in July 1963. The government faced the need to explain how someone who had been declared innocent had apparently been in Soviet hands all along. Harold Macmillan, by that point Prime Minister rather than Foreign Secretary, faced questions in the Commons that were significantly more searching than those he had answered in 1955. The announcement that Philby had probably had Soviet contacts since at least the 1930s was a masterpiece of parliamentary understatement, a formulation that acknowledged what could not be denied while stopping carefully short of saying what everyone now understood: that one of the most senior officers in the history of British intelligence had been a Soviet agent throughout his entire career, that the service had been effectively managed from the inside by the enemy it was supposed to be opposing, and that no one in the institutional apparatus responsible for preventing this had caught it until 30 years of damage had been done. The controlled fury of the Americans was communicated through diplomatic channels, in language of professional restraint and considerable underlying heat. Hoover, whose suspicions had been dismissed or explained away for over a decade, was entitled to his vindication and was not shy about claiming it. The CIA's reaction was complicated by Angleton's personal devastation. The man who had shaped American counterintelligence around the lessons he believed he had learned from Philby found himself confronting the fact that his primary teacher had been his primary adversary, that the education in tradecraft and counterintelligence he had received from a man he admired had been, in the most fundamental possible sense, a Soviet education. The British government moved quickly to brief its allies and to begin the damage assessment that would occupy the intelligence services for years. The scope of what needed to be assessed was enormous. Philby had been inside British intelligence from 1940 to 1951, and had then continued in a liaison and agent role from 1956 to 1963. Over that span of more than 2 decades, the material he had access to and might have passed to Moscow touched virtually every significant Anglo-American intelligence operation conducted during the height of the Cold War. Operations had been compromised. Agents had been killed. Counterintelligence investigations had been deliberately frustrated. The fundamental architecture of the Western intelligence relationship had been shaped, in part, by the distortions introduced by a man who was playing for the other side. The damage assessment was never published in full. It remains, in its most sensitive aspects, classified. What analysts and historians have pieced together from the partial records available and from the testimony of those involved suggests that the estimate of damage, when it was finally completed internally, was even more severe than the initial assessments had indicated. There were operations that had been made to fail whose failure had previously been attributed to other causes. There were agents who had been lost whose loss had previously been explained by operational error rather than betrayal. There were strategic decisions made by Western governments based on intelligence assessments that had been systematically distorted by a man who understood exactly what conclusions his masters in Moscow needed those assessments to generate. Kim Philby, standing in a Moscow that was cold and gray and strange, had completed the long arc of the journey that had begun in a Cambridge common room in 1933. The next chapter would be lived on the other side of the looking glass. The Moscow that Kim Philby arrived in during the early weeks of 1963 was a city in its 8th year of the Khrushchev thaw, still authoritarian, still organized around the fundamental premises of the Soviet state, but lighter in its surface texture than the Stalin era had been, less immediately menacing in the daily experience of ordinary life. The worst of the purges and the forced labor camps were memories rather than current facts, though the machinery that had produced them was by no means dismantled. For Western visitors, Moscow retained its quality of gray strangeness. The wide avenues, the monumental architecture, the absence of the commercial clutter that had come to define Western cities, the particular silence that fell on streets where the background noise of a free market had been eliminated. For Philby, it was not a Western visit. He would not be leaving. The KGB arranged his initial accommodation in a way that was standard practice for high-value defectors of his category. A reasonable apartment, not luxurious but comfortable enough, in one of the areas of Moscow reserved for the foreign-friendly diplomatic and official population. He was given a monthly stipend, an interpreter to assist with the language barrier, and the attention of KGB officers tasked with managing his debriefing and his transition to Soviet life. The debriefing process began almost immediately. Moscow Center had waited 30 years for this man to come home, and they had a very long list of questions. The debriefing was thorough, systematic, and extended over many months. The KGB officers conducting it were senior and experienced, and they were working through the full record of Philby's career with the methodical patience of historians trying to establish a complete archive. Every operation he had been involved in, every agent he had known about, every method he had observed, every liaison meeting he had attended, every piece of intelligence he had passed. All of it was extracted and processed. The material was valuable not only for what it told Moscow about the past, but for what it implied about the present. The methods and structures of British and American intelligence changed slowly, and understanding how they had worked in 1950 provided meaningful insight into how they worked in 1963. What Philby provided in those debriefings was, by any measure, a comprehensive account. He had an exceptional memory, the kind that comes from years of training in environments where documentation was dangerous and the ability to hold large amounts of information in your head was a survival skill. He could reconstruct in detail the organizational structure of departments he had managed 15 years earlier, the cover names of agents he had been briefed on but never met, the communication procedures of operations he had observed from the management level. The KGB received from him a final accounting that closed out decades of asset management. The question of what Philby felt during these debriefings, whether he experienced relief or guilt, or the peculiar lightness of a man who has finally stopped performing, is one that the available evidence cannot fully answer. His subsequent writings and statements were carefully managed documents, filtered through the ideological and political requirements of his Soviet environment, and the genuine interior experience they might contain is extremely difficult to disentangle from the performance. What can be observed is that he approached the work of the debriefing with the same professionalism he had always brought to intelligence work, systematically, thoroughly, without apparent emotional difficulty. The personal situation he found himself in was considerably more difficult than the professional one. Eleanor, his wife, received word through oblique channels in the weeks after his disappearance that he was alive and in Moscow, and she was eventually allowed to join him there in 1963. Her account of what she found when she reached him, written in her memoir, published after their relationship ended, describes a man who was initially pleased to see her, who was making a determined effort to establish normalcy, but who was also clearly navigating enormous stresses that he did not share with her. She noted the drinking, which had reached a level that was no longer socially functional but chronically compulsive. She noted long silences and periods of apparent depression. She noted that the city and the life in it were not what she had expected or what she had been implicitly promised. The KGB's handling of Philby's life in Moscow became a source of tension relatively quickly. He was provided with the material basics but not with the intellectual and social environment he needed. Russian-speaking social connections were limited. His Russian was improving but not yet at a level that allowed genuine friendship to develop naturally. English-speaking contacts in Moscow were few, and those who existed were mostly in the community of other Western defectors and émigré communists, a world that was in many ways more confined and less stimulating than the one he had inhabited in London and Washington. Guy Burgess was there, and the reunion, the first since Philby had watched him leave London under the cloud of the defection planning, was complicated by Burgess's dramatically deteriorated condition. He had been drinking himself to death in Moscow for 12 years, no longer the brilliant and maddening figure he had been in his English life but something diminished and sad, a man whose natural habitat had been the brilliance and argument of English intellectual life and who had been slowly suffocating in its absence. Burgess died in August 1963, 8 months after Philby arrived. The timing gave their reunion a particular quality, the last meeting of two men who had shared a beginning and arrived at very different versions of the same ending. Donald Maclean was also in Moscow, having lived there since his defection in 1951. Maclean had adapted somewhat better than Burgess. He had learned Russian properly, had taken an academic position, had published work on Soviet foreign policy that was taken seriously in specialist circles. But he was also a man who had spent 12 years in a country that was not his, defined by an act that had severed him from everything he had previously known, and the marks of that experience were visible to anyone who paid attention. The two men had significant disagreements about the Soviet Union itself, McLean was by this point genuinely critical of many aspects of the system he had served, and his intellectual honesty was taking him in directions that were not entirely comfortable for the authorities who managed his presence in the country. Philby and McLean were never close in Moscow in the way that they had all been connected in various ways in England. They were strangers who shared a secret, and that is not a foundation for friendship. Eleanor stayed for 2 years, then left. Her departure was precipitated partly by the deteriorating state of Philby's drinking and the emotional unavailability that had worsened rather than improved since his arrival in Moscow, and partly by her discovery that Philby had begun a relationship with McLean's wife, Melinda. The details of this relationship and the period during which it apparently developed are recorded in Eleanor's memoir with a precision that was clearly painful to write. She had arrived in Moscow believing she was joining her husband in a shared exile, and she found instead another version of the experience she had been living through without understanding it for years. The reality that Philby's emotional life, such as it was organized around principles she did not have access to and had not been told about. She flew out of Moscow in 1965 and did not return. The relationship with Melinda McLean eventually ended as well. Philby's fourth significant relationship would come somewhat later, with a KGB interpreter named Rufina Pukova, whom he met in the late 1960s and eventually married in 1971. She was 30 years his junior, intelligent, devoted, and would eventually become the primary caretaker of his reputation after his death, writing her own account of their life together that emphasized his genuine warmth and human qualities in a way that provided a useful counterweight to the cold institutional assessment. The KGB gave Philby, in 1963, the rank of colonel when he arrived, later promoting him to general, though the exact date and circumstances of this promotion are not clearly documented in available sources. He was given work that used his remaining value, advising on Western intelligence services, reviewing operational planning for Soviet intelligence operations in Britain and the United States, training KGB officers who were being prepared for assignments in English-speaking countries. He was, in this role, continuing to do damage to Western intelligence services, though at a remove and in a different mode. The training he provided was genuine, his understanding of how MI6 and the CIA operated, of the social and institutional cultures of the British and American intelligence worlds, of the vulnerabilities and the pressure points in the Western intelligence apparatus, was still current enough in the mid-1960s to be operationally relevant. He also, during this period, produced the memoir that would become the most significant document of his own self-presentation. My Silent War, published in 1968, was written with the assistance of the KGB, who reviewed and approved the text before publication, and was designed in part as a recruitment and propaganda tool. It was distributed in the West, where it became a genuine publishing success, read by intelligence officers, historians, political commentators, and a general public fascinated by the narrative of a man who had been at the center of the most consequential intelligence operations of the Cold War. The book was well-written, atmospheric, sharply observant, deliberately partial, and in certain crucial respects carefully designed to mislead. Philby wrote about his career in terms of political conviction and professional craft, presenting the decisions he had made as consistent, rational, and ultimately justified by the values he had held from the beginning. What the book did not contain, and was never intended to contain, was anything that resembled a complete account or genuine remorse, or the kind of honest reckoning with the human cost of what he had done that a different kind of memoir might have attempted. My Silent War told the world that Kim Philby was at peace with what he had done. Whether that was true is a different question, and one that would take the remaining 2 decades of his life in Moscow to begin to answer. The question that My Silent War refused to answer honestly, and that the people who had known Philby best could not agree on even after his defection was confirmed, was whether any of it had ever been genuinely difficult for him. Whether the 30 years of sustained performance, of faces maintained and friends deceived and colleagues sent to their deaths, had cost him anything at all in the interior spaces that no observer could reach. The people who argued that it had cost him nothing pointed to the record, the steadiness under interrogation, the social ease maintained through crises that would have broken most people, the absence of behavioral signals that betrayal was occurring, no money problems, no drinking of the truly compulsive kind until very late, no erratic behavior, No relationships that suggested the particular emotional damage of a man whose inner life was curdling under pressure. Eileen's psychiatric difficulties were real, but Eileen's difficulties preceded Philby's exposure and had causes that were not reducible to being married to a spy. The surface was intact. If the interior was suffering, it had left no visible marks. The people who argued the opposite pointed to things that were harder to measure but no less real. The drinking, which had been heavy throughout his active career and had escalated significantly in the years before the Beirut flight and in the years after his arrival in Moscow. The emotional unavailability that all three of his early relationships had eventually been consumed by, the quality that Eleanor described, and that Aileen had clearly experienced, of a man who was always offering something and never offering everything, who was present in manner and absent in substance. The way that his life in Moscow, stripped of the performance, had not produced the contentment of a man finally home but something more like a sustained dullness interrupted by alcohol and occasional work. Rufina, his last wife, acknowledged in her account that the years in Moscow were not continuously comfortable, that Philby struggled with the inactivity, with the isolation, with the sense that his value to the Soviet state had been largely exhausted and that the role available to him was that of a symbol rather than an operative. He was an icon of Soviet intelligence success, trotted out for carefully managed encounters with journalists and visiting dignitaries, permitted to give interviews in which he was photographed looking distinguished in his Moscow apartment while the Soviet authorities managed the framing carefully. But he was no longer doing the work that had organized his life for its most productive decades, and the absence of that work created a vacuum that was not easily filled. The intelligence community that he had betrayed was not, meanwhile, simply treating his defection as a closed chapter. The damage assessment work continued through the 1960s and into the 1970s, with each new piece of evidence producing fresh understanding of operations that had been compromised, agents who had been exposed, assessments that had been distorted. One of the most important processes in this reassessment was the systematic attempt to identify which agents and networks had been burned during Philby's tenure at Section 9. Specifically, which of the MI6 operations against Soviet intelligence in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself had been penetrated from the top before they began. The Albanian operation was re-examined in this light, and the conclusions were unambiguous. Every significant insertion had been met by an apparatus that knew it was coming. The anti-Soviet networks that MI6 had been attempting to build inside the USSR and the satellite states during Philby's time in Section 9 were similarly reviewed, and the patterns of their failures previously attributed to bad luck, poor tradecraft, or the inherent difficulty of operating inside a surveillance state, were reread as evidence of systematic betrayal. The reassessment changed not just the understanding of specific operations but the overall picture of what Soviet intelligence had known about Western capabilities during a critical decade of the Cold War. The American side of the damage assessment was complicated by the Angleton problem. James Angleton, having been revealed as the most comprehensively deceived of all Philby's victims, reacted to the disaster in a way that was psychologically understandable but professionally catastrophic. He became consumed by the hypothesis that the Soviet penetration of Western intelligence had not ended with Philby, that there were other moles in place, perhaps many of them, planted by a Soviet service that had demonstrated it could do exactly this. His reading of the Golitsyn material, combined with his own experience of having been fundamentally deceived by the person he trusted most in the intelligence world, produced a framework of suspicion that he applied to everything and everyone with progressively less discrimination. The counterintelligence operation that Angleton ran from this position, sometimes called the Mole Hunt, lasted for more than a decade and effectively paralyzed significant parts of the CIA's Soviet Operations Division. Officers who came under suspicion, sometimes on the flimsiest of evidence, sometimes on patterns of reasoning that were more about Angleton's framework than about objective evidence, found their careers suspended or destroyed, cases built against them that dissolved under external scrutiny, lives damaged in ways that were never fully repaired. When Angleton was finally forced out of the CIA in December 1974, following the exposure of various domestic CIA surveillance programs that had no business being conducted, the post-mortem on his mole hunt was devastating. Not a single confirmed Soviet agent had been identified through it, while a significant number of innocent officers had been treated as suspects. The historical judgment is that Angleton's reaction to the Philby betrayal understandable in emotional and even professional terms, represented a second wave of damage done by Philby, not directly, but through the institutional trauma his example had created. The fear of penetration, activated by the proof that penetration of the most extreme kind was possible, generated a counterintelligence posture that was in its own way as damaging as the penetration itself. The lesson supposed to be drawn from Philby, build better vetting, improve internal security, create more robust procedures for identifying and managing risk, was in Angleton's case displaced by a different lesson entirely. Trust no one, see every unexplained failure as the work of a hidden hand, treat ambiguity as evidence of deception rather than as the normal condition of complex intelligence work. Philby's effect on the CIA did not end with his defection. It continued through Angleton's paranoia for another 11 years. In Britain, the damage manifested differently. Parliament conducted inquiries. The government produced reports calibrated to reveal as little as possible while acknowledging enough to prevent the critique of concealment from having more force than the critique of failure. The internal culture of MI6 was gradually and reluctantly reshaped. Vetting procedures that had relied on class background and personal recommendation as primary indicators of trustworthiness were supplemented with more systematic methods, though the process was slow and incomplete. The idea that a man's provenance could guarantee his loyalty, that where he had gone to school and who his father was and which clubs he belonged to constituted meaningful intelligence about his reliability, was not instantaneously abandoned, because institutions do not abandon their foundational assumptions easily. But it was mortally wounded. The spy fiction that emerged in the decade after Philby's defection reflected the new psychological reality. John Le Carre, who had briefly been an MI5 and then MI6 officer before becoming a writer, produced in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and then in Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy a vision of the intelligence world that was saturated with the Philby experience. A world in which the most dangerous threat came from inside the institution rather than outside it, in which loyalty was performed rather than felt, in which the distinction between the spy and the man he was playing had been so thoroughly collapsed that the question of authenticity had been rendered permanently unanswerable. Le Carre never identified Philby directly as the model for the mole at the center of his most celebrated novel, but the parallel was clear enough that commentators identified it immediately. The character of Bill Hayden in Tinker, Tailor, charming, aristocratic, intellectually brilliant, personally magnetic, and systematically treacherous, was drawn from a recognizable original. The fiction mattered because it shaped public understanding of what intelligence services were and what they could be. Before Philby, the spy genre tended toward the heroic, agents in the field, foreign enemies, clear moral distinctions between the people protecting freedom and the people threatening it. After Philby, the dominant literary register was irony, ambiguity, and institutional betrayal. The threat was internal. The loyalty was conditional. The institutions themselves were suspect. This shift in cultural understanding was not trivial. It affected how parliaments thought about oversight, how governments approached the management of their intelligence services, and how the public understood the limits of its own knowledge about the institutions operating in its name. Philby, sitting in his Moscow apartment with his vodka and his KGB medals and his increasingly distant memories of the world he had inhabited for 3 decades, had changed not only the operations he had directly compromised. He had changed permanently the way the Western world thought about itself. The other members of the Cambridge Five lived out their own versions of a consequence they had all, in different degrees and at different times, perhaps anticipated. The network's survival as an undetected operation for 20 years, Burgess and McLean defected in 1951, Philby in 1963, while Blunt's confession remained secret until 1979 and Cairncross's full role was not publicly established until the early 1990s, meant that the unraveling was slow, staggered, and in some cases almost inconceivably delayed. Anthony Blunt's situation was perhaps the most remarkable of all in terms of its management by the British state. Blunt had been questioned several times in the 1950s, following the Burgess-McLean defection and subsequently during the various investigations that Philby's case generated. He had denied being a Soviet agent. His denials were not believed by all of the investigators, but they could not be definitively refuted. The evidence against him was strong circumstantially, but, in the familiar pattern, not conclusive enough for the thresholds of the British legal system. He continued in his public life through the 1950s and into the early 1960s as one of the most distinguished art historians in Britain, the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, a knight of the realm, a trusted and respected member of the cultural establishment. In 1964, a year after Philby's defection had confirmed the general shape of the Cambridge network beyond any reasonable doubt, Blunt was finally confronted again, this time with information derived in part from an American citizen named Michael Straight, who had been recruited by Blunt at Cambridge in the 1930s and who had eventually decided in 1963 to tell the FBI what he knew. Straight's account identified Blunt directly. The British authorities were informed, and a deal was made. Blunt would be granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full and honest confession about his activities as a Soviet agent. The deal was ratified at the level of the Prime Minister's office. Blunt confessed. He provided a comprehensive account of his recruitment, his activities, and the other members of the network he had known about. Given immunity, he was allowed to continue his career, his public life, and his knighthood, a state of affairs that was known to the British government and to MI5 for 15 years before it became public. When Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher finally revealed Blunt's role in Parliament in November 1979, following the imminent publication of a book that would have disclosed it otherwise, the revelation was followed almost immediately by the stripping of his knighthood. But the immunity deal held, he was never prosecuted. The public reaction to the Blunt revelation, and to the managed way in which the government had handled his confession, was significant. It confirmed a suspicion that had been building since the Burgess-MacLean defection, that the British establishment had a systematic tendency to protect its own, to manage its embarrassments internally and quietly rather than expose them to the full force of the legal and democratic processes that applied to everyone else. The class dimension of this tendency was impossible to ignore. The men who had been most extensively protected from the full consequences of their treason were men of education, background, and social connection, men who had always had access to the networks of protection that operate in societies where certain kinds of people are considered differently from others. John Cairncross, the fifth member, occupied a somewhat separate track from the others. He had not been at Cambridge in the same social circles, had not come from quite the same background, had been recruited slightly later and through a slightly different mechanism, and had never been socially associated with the others in ways that connected him to their visible story. His activities were not definitively established publicly until the early 1990s, following the partial opening of KGB archives and the publication of various memoirs and studies that identified him specifically. He had been questioned in 1951 when papers in Burgess's possession, left behind at the time of his defection, included documents that seemed to connect Cairncross to Soviet intelligence. He admitted to some contact but denied full agent status, and the case against him at that point was insufficient for prosecution. He spent much of his subsequent life in Europe and the United States, working in international organizations, before his role was publicly confirmed in the years before his death in 1995. The divergent fates of the five members, one dying in Moscow having been publicly identified as a traitor, one dying in Moscow having been publicly identified and exiled since 1951, one receiving immunity, losing a knighthood, dying in 1983 in professional disgrace despite continued scholarly work, one ending his life in a relative obscurity that was itself a kind of protection, and Philby, ending his in Moscow as the most famous spy of the 20th century, reflected the differing degrees of exposure, the different moments at which each was caught, and the different calculations made by the British state about what it could afford to reveal. The Soviet side of the story, which became partially visible through archive releases after the Cold War ended, provided a different kind of illumination. The KGB's internal assessment of the Cambridge network, as reflected in documents made available to researchers in the 1990s, was one of institutional pride combined with operational sophistication. The network was regarded within Soviet intelligence as perhaps the single greatest achievement of the interwar and wartime period, a penetration operation whose scope and duration and consequence had no parallel in the history of the intelligence war between East and West. The handlers who had recruited and managed the five men were celebrated internally. Their methods were studied as models. The recruitment principles that Arnold Deutsch had applied in the 1930s, targeting ideologically committed individuals at elite institutions during periods of political crisis, running them through cutouts, developing them patiently toward positions of maximum access rather than extracting immediate tactical value, were codified as doctrine and applied to subsequent recruitment operations. The debate within the KGB about the Cambridge network was not entirely uncritical, however. There had been periods during the 1930s and 1940s when the intense suspicion generated by Stalin's paranoia had led Soviet intelligence to doubt the authenticity of even their best sources. Not because these sources had given any reason for doubt, but because the psychology of Stalinist security culture presumed that anything appearing too good was probably a provocation. The Cambridge agents had, at various points, been suspected by their own handlers of being double agents, British plants, run to deceive Moscow rather than to inform it. These suspicions led to periods where the intelligence they were providing was treated with skepticism rather than acted upon, moments of self-defeating caution that reduced the operational value of a network that was, in fact, entirely genuine. This paradox, a Soviet intelligence culture so suspicious of Western deception that it sometimes failed to trust its most reliable sources, ran as a thread through the history of the Cambridge network and contributed to a picture that was, from the Soviet perspective, not simply one of triumph. The network had been managed with great skill at some moments and with frustrating inefficiency at others. The full potential of what the Cambridge Five could provide had been realized in some periods and squandered in others by the bureaucratic and psychological dysfunctions of Moscow Center. For Philby personally, the Soviet side perspective added another layer of complexity to his already complicated position. He had given 50 years of his life to an organization and a cause, and the organization's internal history suggested that the cause had not always been worthy of the sacrifice, had been afflicted with the same bureaucratic failures, the same institutional blindness, the same corrosive effects of unaccountable power that he had attributed, in his critiques, exclusively to the capitalist and imperialist institutions he had been fighting against. The Soviet Union, as he discovered in living inside it rather than serving it from abroad, was not the thing he had believed in when he was 22 years old reading Marx in a Cambridge common room. It was something more complicated, more damaged, more human, and in its own way more disappointing. Whether Philby allowed himself to actually hold that thought, to let it settle into the part of him where convictions rather than calculations lived, is perhaps the most interesting and least answerable question his life poses. To fully account for what Kim Philby cost the West, to produce a number, a list of operations, a tally of lives and policy decisions and strategic positions, is an exercise that the available evidence still cannot complete. The most sensitive portions of the British damage assessment remain classified. The American assessments compiled by the CIA and the FBI have been partially released through the Freedom of Information process, but significant sections are withheld on grounds of protecting ongoing intelligence capabilities and the identities of sources and methods. The KGB's own records, some of which were made available to selected Western researchers in the 1990s under circumstances that were themselves the subject of intelligence interest, provide context without completeness. What can be assembled from the partially available material is a picture whose outlines are clear even where the details remain in shadow. The most immediate and human cost was carried by the agents and operatives who were betrayed directly. The men sent into Albania through Operation Valuable and Operation Fiend were told that Western intelligence was committed to supporting them, that the risks they were taking were calculated against a realistic assessment of the operation's prospects, and that the institutional power of the British and American services was behind them. None of that was true in the way they had been led to believe. Between 1950 and 1952, the CIA and MI6 inserted approximately 300 men into Albania in groups and individually, with the aim of making contact with resistance networks and beginning the infrastructure of a sustained challenge to the Haja government. The number who survived in any operative capacity was minimal. Most were captured within weeks or months of insertion. The Albanian Security Service's conduct of the counter-operation was, by the assessment of people who later reviewed it, so precisely calibrated to the incoming groups that it could not have been achieved through general alertness and efficient security procedures alone. It required foreknowledge. The identities of the captured men were used to extract further information about the Western networks operating in the region, other agents, communication protocols, contact names, methods. Each capture produced a set of leads that allowed the counterintelligence operation to extend further. The original betrayal of the operations planning created a secondary wave of exposure as the captures generated information that compromised adjacent networks. Operation Climber, Operation Valuable, Operation Footless. The names varied somewhat as the insertions were planned and executed across different stages and under slightly different institutional auspices as the CIA took on a progressively larger role from the British. The underlying story was consistent. Men went in, men were caught, men were tried in Albanian courts, executed or given long prison sentences, while the planning that had sent them was already in Moscow's hands before the first boat left Italian waters. The Albanian example was the most dramatic and the most documented of the operations that Philby directly compromised. But it was not the only one. The attempts during the late 1940s and early 1950s to insert agents into the Soviet Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, where partisan resistance to Soviet rule had continued for years after the end of the Second World War, were conducted in parallel with the Albanian operations, using broadly similar methods, and they suffered broadly similar results. Agents inserted with forged documents, communication equipment, and carefully prepared cover stories were met with operational environments that somehow anticipated their arrival. Resistance networks that Western intelligence believed to be functioning turned out, in many cases, to be controlled by Soviet security, double agents managed by the MGB, the predecessor of the KGB, who had been used to maintain the appearance of active resistance while providing a mechanism to capture and interrogate incoming Western agents. The extent to which Philby's specific intelligence contributed to the failure of the Baltic operations, as distinct from the activities of other Soviet sources operating within Western intelligence during the same period, cannot be precisely established from available evidence. The Soviet services were running multiple penetration operations simultaneously, and disentangling the contribution of any one source to a pattern of failures that had multiple causes is methodologically difficult. What is clear is that the period of Philby's tenure at Section 9 and his Washington posting roughly corresponds to the period of the most systematic failures, and that the intelligence he was providing covered precisely the categories of operational planning and personnel identification that would have been most useful for neutralizing the operations that failed. Beyond the direct operational damage, Philby's career cost the West something that is harder to quantify but arguably more consequential in the long run. A decade of strategic intelligence about Soviet intentions and capabilities that was substantially skewed. The material reaching Western decision-makers through MI6 and the CIA during the late 1940s and early 1950s reflected, in its analysis and its conclusions, the work of an organization that was receiving distorted input. When Philby shaped the interpretation of intelligence, deciding which assessments to emphasize, which leads to pursue, which analytical frameworks to apply, he was not simply hiding Soviet operations. He was influencing the picture of Soviet intentions and capabilities that British and American governments were using to make decisions about nuclear strategy, alliance management, and the fundamental architecture of the Cold War confrontation. The distortion was subtle and professional, not crude. Philby did not invent intelligence or produce outright fabrications that could be clearly identified as false. He worked within the legitimate analytical process, steering interpretations along lines that were defensible and not obviously wrong, but that consistently produced conclusions less threatening to Soviet interests, less productive for Western containment strategy, and less useful to the policymakers who were trying to understand what the Soviet Union was actually doing and planning. The intelligence assessment of Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe during the late 1940s, the period of the Berlin blockade, the Czech coup, the formation of NATO, was produced by an organization that was being subtly managed from inside. Post-Cold War analysis of this period, drawing on the partial availability of Soviet archives and on the research of historians who have spent decades cross-referencing Western intelligence assessments against what is now known about actual Soviet intentions and decisions, suggests that the Western intelligence picture was systematically more reassuring about Soviet restraint and less accurate about Soviet ambition than it should have been. Whether this can be attributed specifically to Philby's management of the Section 9 analytical function, or whether it reflects a broader failure of Western intelligence analysis in which Philby's contributions were merely one factor among several, is a question that the historiography has not yet fully resolved. What is not in doubt is that the period in which the fundamental structures of the Cold War were being established, the alliances, the strategic doctrines, the intelligence relationships, the assessment frameworks that would govern the confrontation for the next 40 years, was a period in which the most senior British intelligence capacity for assessing and responding to the Soviet threat was commanded by a man who was reporting to Moscow. The foundations of the Western intelligence response to the Cold War were built in the shadow of this betrayal. The reforms that followed Philby's exposure attempted to address the most obvious institutional vulnerabilities. The over-reliance on class background and social connection as vetting mechanisms, the internal culture of trust that had allowed a senior officer's word to function as a sufficient shield against serious investigation, the inadequate compartmentalization that had allowed a single individual to have visibility across the full spectrum of the most sensitive operations. The positive vetting procedures that MI5 and MI6 adopted in the years after the Burgess-McClane defection, and that were strengthened further after Philby's flight to Moscow, were designed to provide systematic rather than impressionistic assessment of reliability and vulnerability. Roughly analogous reforms were made in the American services, with varying degrees of effectiveness and varying degrees of damage to the institutional cultures they were applied to. These reforms were real and, in important respects, effective. The Western intelligence services that existed by the 1970s and 1980s were genuinely different institutions from the ones that Philby had moved through, more systematically organized, more carefully monitored, more rigorous in their security procedures, less dependent on the gentleman's assurance that had been the primary currency of trust in the world of Philby's generation. They were not invulnerable. Subsequent cases on both the British and American sides demonstrated that the problem of insider betrayal was not solved by improved procedures, merely managed more effectively. But the worst of the structural vulnerabilities that Philby had exploited were, in the aftermath of his exposure, finally addressed. The broader cultural shift was perhaps the most durable consequence. The possibility that any institution's most trusted member might be its most committed enemy, that loyalty could be performed flawlessly for decades, that the signals of trustworthiness could be indistinguishable from the reality, entered Western consciousness in a way that it had not fully inhabited before. It changed how intelligence services were overseen and how their personnel were assessed. It changed how the public and their elected representatives thought about the gap between institutional claims and institutional realities. It changed, permanently, the cultural grammar of trust. The later Moscow years were quieter in outward character than anything Kim Philby had experienced since childhood. A settled domestic routine, a marriage that was by most accounts genuinely companionate, a city that had become familiar if never entirely home. He and Rufina lived in a comfortable apartment in a cooperative building on the Patriarch's Ponds district of central Moscow, an area of 19th-century streets and quiet squares that had literary associations. Bulgakov had written about it, and that preserved something of the Moscow that had existed before the Soviet urban transformation of the 1930s. The apartment was well appointed by Soviet standards, filled with books in English, furnished in ways that reflected Rufina's tastes and her practical management of their domestic life. Philby's relationship with Rufina Pukova was the longest and most stable of his life. She had been born in 1932, 50 years his junior, a Russian who had worked as a KGB interpreter and had met Philby at a social gathering in 1968, 5 years after his arrival in Moscow. She describes in her memoir a man who was, when they met in his mid-50s, still charming, still intellectually alive, still capable of the social grace that had always been one of his most remarkable qualities, but also visibly marked by the years, carrying the drinking and its consequences in ways that were becoming harder to conceal. She chose him anyway, with a clarity of judgment that her subsequent life would test severely. They married in 1971. The life they built together was, by her account, genuinely loving within its constraints. He was attentive as a partner, interested in her thoughts, willing to participate in the ordinary details of domestic life in a way that stood in contrast to his opacity in all the deeper matters. He talked about his work, or rather, about the work of his past, the cases and the methods and the professional culture of the world he had inhabited, with the enthusiasm of a man who had genuinely loved what he did, even if what he had done was the opposite of what his colleagues believed it was. The intellectual pleasure of intelligence work, the analysis, the pattern recognition, the management of information under conditions of uncertainty, had always been real for him, independent of its direction. In Moscow, with the KGB advisory work declining and eventually ceasing entirely as his useful professional knowledge aged past its operational relevance, what remained was the memory and the conversation about it. He drank. The drinking was a constant through these years, integrated into the daily structure in a way that Rufina managed with the practicality of someone who had determined that the relationship was worth the management. Heavy evenings with vodka, mornings that began slowly, periods of several weeks where the consumption would escalate beyond what his body could comfortably absorb, and then a period of reduction forced by his health. The KGB provided access to medical care that was superior to what ordinary Soviet citizens received, and there were hospitalizations along the way for the cardiovascular effects that decades of serious drinking had accumulated. He would emerge from these periods, recover partially, resume. The interviews he gave during the 1970s and 1980s were carefully managed performances. Western journalists who obtained access to him, and the KGB granted access selectively, choosing correspondence and occasions that seemed likely to produce material serving Soviet interests, found a figure who was composed, articulate, and curiously self-contained. He did not rant against Britain or America. He did not produce the kind of defamatory denunciations that would have been easy to dismiss. He spoke about his past with a measured analytical quality, as if assessing someone else's career rather than his own, allowing just enough personal voice to create an impression of candor while maintaining the complete control over information that had been his professional hallmark. The question that every interviewer wanted to ask, and that most of them did in some form, was whether he regretted it. Whether the life he had chosen, having revealed all of its consequences, was one he would choose again. His answers varied slightly in phrasing but were consistent in substance. No. He believed what he had believed. He had acted on those beliefs. He did not apologize for them. He acknowledged that the human costs had been real, that individuals had been hurt, that the people closest to him had been damaged by his secrets, but he contained these acknowledgments within a framework of historical judgment that treated them as regrettable particulars within a justifiable larger purpose. This was the answer of a man who had decided long ago that the correct psychological position was not one that allowed deep engagement with individual consequences. The people in the Albanian operations, the defectors who had been betrayed, the officers whose careers had been damaged, the Allied agents whose identities had been passed to Moscow, to think about them individually with the full weight of what had happened to each of them would require a form of engagement that the psychological architecture of Kim Philby had been carefully designed to prevent. The architecture had been built to serve the work. The work was done. The architecture remained. But there are hints in the record that the architecture was not entirely impermeable. The drinking, for one thing, is not meaningless. People who drink at the level Philby sustained for 40 years are not, on the whole, people who have achieved the interior peace their public positions project. The particular quality of Rufina's descriptions of his silences, his retreats, his unreachable periods, suggests a man who was not always at the serene center of his own convictions. There was something he was not saying, and not only because of the political environment in which he was living. His relationship with his children, he had 5 from his marriage to Aileen, was genuinely fond, as far as it could be conducted across the Cold War division that made contact extremely difficult. Letters occasionally arrived. There were a small number of visits, organized through the Soviet authorities under circumstances that made natural interaction impossible. His eldest son, John, published a brief memoir of his experiences visiting his father in Moscow that describes encounters suffused with affection and distance in approximately equal measure. A man who was clearly glad to see his son and clearly incapable of repairing what 30 years of sustained deception and eventual disappearance had done to the relationship. His father, St. John Philby, had died in September 1960, 3 years before Kim's flight to Moscow. The man whose example had shaped so much of Kim's self-understanding, the brilliant, restless outsider, the man who had chosen loyalty to an idea over loyalty to the institutions that had trained him, died without knowing the full extent of his son's double life. St. John had known, by the time of his death, that Kim was under suspicion. He had not known that the suspicions were accurate in every detail his investigators had imagined and more. The irony that the man who had most influenced Kim's sense of himself as someone who could stand apart from the institutions of his upbringing had spent his last years not knowing who his son actually was runs through the Philby story with the particular sadness of things that can never be undone. By the 1980s, Philby was visible in Moscow in a limited way, occasionally photographed, occasionally quoted in Soviet publications, occasionally made available to carefully selected visiting Western journalists or academics. The KGB awarded him the Order of the Red Banner and the Order of Lenin, and the formal ceremonies around these awards were documented, photographs of a white-haired man in a suit receiving medals from men in uniform. He looked, in these photographs, distinguished and somewhat remote, a man more comfortable in ceremony than in scrutiny. The Soviet state he had served was, by the 1980s, entering the phase of its final dissolution, though this was not obvious at the time and would not be fully apparent until the Gorbachev reforms of the mid-decade created conditions that none of the system's architects had intended or anticipated. Philby was aware of the reforms, interested in them as an analyst watching a system he knew well attempt to adjust itself under new pressures. Whether he was optimistic about their prospects is not clearly established. The Soviet intellectuals and officials he had access to were themselves divided about what Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika meant and where they were heading. Philby, whose analytical instincts remained sharp even as his operational usefulness had faded, was presumably capable of reading the signals that many of his Soviet interlocutors hoped were something other than what they turned out to be. He died on May 11, 1988, in Moscow, at the age of 76. The cause was heart failure, the accumulated consequence of decades of heavy drinking, the aging of a body that had been subjected to more than most. He died in the apartment he had shared with Rufina, in the city in which he had spent the last 25 years of his life. He was buried in the Kuntsevo cemetery in Moscow, with a state funeral attended by KGB officers and Soviet intelligence officials. His gravestone, in a section of the cemetery reserved for KGB personnel and their families, bears his name. In a ceremony that was characteristic of the Soviet state's management of its own mythology, he was honored as a hero of Soviet intelligence. The Soviet Union itself survived him by 3.5 years. In December 1991, the state to which he had devoted 50 years of his life, beginning in a Cambridge common room in the year Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, ceased to exist as a legal and political entity, its republics declaring independence, its institutions dissolving into the successor organizations that would govern the post-Soviet space. The KGB was formally dissolved in late October 1991, replaced by a set of successor agencies that divided its functions among different institutional inheritances. The ideological framework that had given Philby's choices their moral context, the belief that the Soviet Union represented a historical alternative to capitalism, a different and ultimately better organization of human society, had not simply failed in the grand catastrophic manner of a military defeat. It had subsided slowly and messily under the accumulated weight of its own contradictions, until the people living inside it had simply stopped being willing to pretend that it worked. It is tempting to ask what Philby would have felt about this outcome had he lived to see it. It is tempting, but probably unanswerable. The man who had given his life to the cause of Soviet communism had also given his life to the practice of not revealing what he actually felt about anything that mattered. The discipline of concealment, built over 50 years and sustained through every kind of pressure, does not simply dissolve because the external circumstances that required it have changed. It becomes part of the person. What we can say is that the question haunted, in various ways, everyone who had known him. Nicholas Elliott, the man who had confronted him in Beirut and then watched him disappear, lived until 1994 and spent the years after Philby's defection in a state of what his own memoir characterizes as genuine struggle. Not with guilt, which would require identifying yourself as responsible for the outcome, but with the deeper disorientation of a person whose model of reality has been demonstrated to be fundamentally inaccurate. He had believed he knew Kim Philby. The demonstration that he did not, that the man he had known was also, simultaneously, someone else entirely, was an epistemological wound that did not close cleanly. James Angleton, who died in 1987, a year before Philby, had spent his final years in a version of the same disorientation, amplified by the CIA's forced recognition that his mole hunt had damaged more innocent people than guilty ones. He remained convinced until the end that Soviet penetration was deeper and more systematic than anyone in official Washington was willing to admit. There were those who believed his conviction had been distorted past the point of utility by the original trauma of his friendship with Philby. There were others who thought he might have been right about the general threat, even if wrong about many of the specific accusations. The argument continues in the intelligence history literature. Rufina Philby continued to live in the Moscow apartment after her husband's death, becoming over the years the primary custodian of his reputation and his letters, giving occasional interviews, maintaining contact with the intelligence historians and journalists who found in Kim Philby's life a story that could not be exhausted by any single account. She co-authored a memoir, The Private Life of Kim Philby, published in 1999, which presented the human being she had known imperfect, damaged, loving in his particular constrained way, alongside the intelligence legend that the public record had created. It was an honest book within its limits, which were the limits of what a person who had loved someone could say about them while remaining true to the love. The limits of the love, and the limits of any single account, are perhaps the most appropriate place to pause before the final reckoning. There is a photograph of Kim Philby, taken in Moscow sometime in the 1970s, that appears in various books and documentary films about his life. He is sitting in what appears to be a comfortable chair, dressed in a plain shirt and trousers, looking directly at the camera with an expression that is almost impossible to read. He looks intelligent, comfortable in the frame, neither cheerful nor unhappy. Simply present, a man in a room, holding the space with the practiced ease of someone who has been observed throughout a long life and has learned to give nothing away. The photograph could be of a retired professor, a diplomat resting between appointments, a writer pausing from his work. It could not tell you, if you did not already know, what this man had done. That photograph captures something essential about the problem Kim Philby poses. The surface is exactly what a surface should be, inert, neutral, providing no purchase for the eye that wants to find behind it the evidence of everything that lay within. The interior does not leak. The face does not confess. Whatever is happening behind those eyes is inaccessible to the viewer, just as it was inaccessible to the colleagues and handlers and lovers and interrogators who tried to reach it across decades of proximity. In the years since his death in 1988, the literature on Philby has grown substantially, as declassified material from British, American, and partially accessible Soviet archives has been combined with memoirs, journalism, academic history, and biographical scholarship to produce an increasingly detailed picture of what he did and when. The picture is not complete, the most sensitive damage assessments remain withheld, and the full Soviet record of his handling and debriefing has never been publicly released. But it is far more detailed than anything available in his own lifetime, or in the 2 decades immediately following his defection. What the accumulated scholarship confirms, above all, is the scale. This was not a man who passed a few sensitive documents to a foreign power and escaped the consequences. This was a man who penetrated British intelligence at the highest levels, maintained that penetration for over 2 decades, directly compromised some of the most significant Western intelligence operations of the early Cold War, and contributed to shaping the strategic environment of the Cold War confrontation at its most formative and critical period. The breadth of what he touched, from wartime code-breaking intelligence to post-war counterintelligence planning, from the special relationship between Britain and America to the operations aimed at reversing communist rule in Eastern Europe, makes any single-dimension assessment inadequate to the reality. The various communities that have assessed his legacy rarely converge on a single judgment, which is itself an indication of the complexity. Within the intelligence world, the professional assessment is largely one of horrified respect. People who have spent their careers in intelligence work, who understand from the inside what is involved in managing sources and protecting operations, tend to assess Philby's tradecraft with a cold admiration that sits uncomfortably alongside their judgment of what he did. The discipline alone, the sustained, daily performance of a false identity for 30 years, without the cracking that comes to almost everyone who carries a significant deception for any prolonged period, was a professional achievement of the first order in a technical sense. The operational management, positioning himself for maximum access, managing the intelligence flow to maximize value while minimizing the risk of exposure, handling the crises of the Volkov case and the Burgess-McLean defection without breaking, reflected a level of operational skill that professionals recognize even as they condemn its application. The moral assessment within the intelligence world is less complicated. He was a traitor who got people killed, who damaged the institutions entrusted to protect democratic societies, and whose actions contributed to the suffering of the people living under the communist systems that his intelligence served and strengthened. The men in Albania, the defectors who were returned to Moscow, the agents whose identities were passed through Section 9 into KGB files, whose subsequent fates varied from imprisonment to execution to permanent operational neutralization. These were the human products of his service, and no analytical admiration for the tradecraft changes what those products were. The historical assessment is more complex and more contested. Historians have debated what difference Philby actually made to the outcome of the Cold War, whether the strategic picture would have been meaningfully different in the absence of his contribution. The argument that it would not have been fundamentally different rests on the observation that the Cambridge Network was not the only Soviet penetration of Western intelligence during this period, that Soviet intelligence had multiple other sources, and that the redundancy of the network meant that removing any one element would not have changed the overall intelligence balance. The argument that it would have been meaningfully different rests on the unique combination of access and operational authority that Philby possessed, the fact that he was not simply a passive source but an active intelligence officer who could actively frustrate Western operations against Soviet intelligence, not merely report on them. Both arguments have force. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, that Philby's contribution was significant and in certain specific operations decisive, but that the overall strategic intelligence picture during the Cold War was shaped by factors considerably larger than any single source, even the most exceptional. The political and cultural judgment has evolved significantly over the decades since his defection. In the immediate aftermath of 1963, and through the years when the Cold War was an active and immediate confrontation, the public understanding of Philby was calibrated by the moral framework of that confrontation. He was a traitor who had worked for an enemy power, a man whose actions had arguably helped to extend and deepen the communist control of Eastern Europe that was causing real suffering to millions of people. The fact that he had been motivated by ideological conviction rather than by money or blackmail was, in this framework, aggravating rather than mitigating. It meant that he had chosen this deliberately, eyes open, sustained by conviction rather than driven by desperation. As the Cold War receded into history and the Soviet Union demonstrated through its final collapse that the system Philby had served had been both less powerful and more self-defeating than many of its adversaries had feared, the moral framework of the assessment became more complicated. The ideology he had served had resulted not in the emancipated society he had envisioned in 1933, but in 7 decades of authoritarian rule, forced collectivization, the Gulag mass deportations, and the systematic suppression of the very freedoms, intellectual, political, civic, that the young men of Cambridge had imagined communism would produce. Whether Philby, who knew the Soviet Union from the inside for 25 years, had ever fully reckoned with this gap between the vision and the reality remains, as noted, a question the evidence cannot resolve. What can be said is that he never said so. Not in print, not on record, not in any of the testimony available. He defended his choices to the last interview that can be reliably attributed to him. He was a man who had made a commitment in 1934 and had organized his life around it with a completeness that made the idea of disavowing it feel, presumably, like the disavowal of himself. There is a question that sits at the center of his story and refuses to be resolved by any accumulation of facts. Was there a real Kim Philby? And if so, what did he actually believe and what did he actually feel? The question is not merely philosophical. It has practical implications for how we understand the security failure his case represents, because the kind of person who could sustain a complete double identity for 30 years without breaking is either a person whose emotional architecture is so profoundly different from the common human range that ordinary psychological categories do not apply, a sociopath in the clinical language, or is a person whose commitment was so total, whose belief was so absolute, that it operated as a kind of second nature rather than a maintenance cost. The first explanation is useful for comprehension because it removes the case from the realm of the ordinary and makes it a kind of aberration, a pathology that does not imply anything generalizable. The second explanation is more disturbing because it implies that the conditions that produce a Philby, the ideological ferment, the institutional blind spots, the culture of misplaced trust, are reproducible, that the combination of extraordinary individual ability and extraordinary external circumstance could produce this again. The intelligence services that reorganized themselves in the aftermath of Philby's exposure chose, implicitly, to accept something like the second explanation. They did not conclude that only a uniquely pathological individual could do what Philby had done. They concluded that the conditions that had enabled him were systemic and needed to be changed. The vetting reforms, the changes to internal culture, the development of more rigorous counterintelligence procedures, all of these were premised on the recognition that the vulnerability was institutional rather than individual, that any sufficiently motivated and capable person in the right position at the right time could do significant damage, and that the obligation of the institution was to reduce the combination of right position and right time to as close to zero as the operational requirements of the service allowed. The reforms have been partially successful. They have not been completely successful, as the cases from later decades on both sides of the Atlantic demonstrated. The problem of insider betrayal did not end with Philby. It evolved with the evolution of the institutions and the individuals who staffed them. But it was never again possible to do what Philby had done in quite the way he had done it, to rise to the directorship of the anti-Soviet section of the British intelligence service as a 30-year veteran Soviet agent, to sit at the table where the most sensitive Anglo-American operations were planned and report their contents directly to the people they were planned against. That specific configuration of vulnerabilities was closed, partially and imperfectly, by the institutional response to his exposure. The human cost of closing it was real too, the careers damaged by Angleton's mole hunt, the institutional trust that was replaced in some services by institutional suspicion that was sometimes as operationally dysfunctional as the excessive trust it replaced. Managing the response to Philby cost the Western intelligence community nearly as much in some respects as Philby himself had cost it. That is the nature of the damage a penetration agent of his caliber inflicts. Not just the direct damage of the secrets past, but the secondary damage of the suspicion created and the institutional culture reshaped in ways that can outlast the original operation by decades. Kim Philby's name appears on Russian postal stamps, issued in 1990, alongside other celebrated Soviet intelligence figures. His image is preserved in the corridors of the SVR, the Russian intelligence service that is the direct institutional successor of the KGB, where he is honored as a hero. His grave in the Kontsevo cemetery is maintained. His story is taught in the training programs of Russian intelligence, used as a case study in the principles of long-term penetration, agent development, and the management of cover identities. In Britain, his name attaches to something rather different, to the institutional embarrassment, the post-mortem inquiry, the long process of reckoning with what it means for a democratic society to have its most sensitive institutions penetrated and managed by an adversary for 30 years. His photograph does not appear on British stamps. His grave is in a foreign country. The boy given a spy's nickname by a father who wanted him to be fluent in multiple worlds grew up to inhabit multiple worlds more completely than his father had ever intended, or, perhaps, more completely than even his father had imagined possible. What the boy from Westminster School and Trinity College became was the thing he had been named after. The figure who passes through, who serves, who observes, who belongs everywhere and is truly from nowhere, whose deepest loyalty cannot be located by anyone looking from the outside. He was, in the end, exactly what his father had called him, decades before the calling had any content beyond a literary affection. He was Kim, the spy who never came home,